If you close your eyes for a moment and let the Mediterranean roll beneath you like an old friend, you can imagine the scene that gave rise to Carthage. A seafaring world where coastlines and islands were as familiar as neighbors, and where ships were not mere tools but the lifeblood of entire societies. Men and women from cities like Tyre and Sidon knew the sea as intimately as farmers knew their fields. They read winds and currents the way later generations would read maps. Their ships cut across blue distances, calling at ports, trading for things that mattered to urban life: metal for tools, timber for houses, and rare dyes for the rich. From this braided world of commerce and courage, the seed of a new city took root on the North African shore. The story of Carthage began with people who trusted the sea more than the land. Subscribe and share in the comments what moves you more: their daring to sail into the unknown or their hope to create a new home on distant shores. Long before Carthage declared itself a power to be reckoned with, the Phoenician traders who founded it carried a particular combination of talents: a mastery of craft, a gift for negotiation, and a boldness that turned risk into profit. Phoenician skill in making things that dazzled the markets helped them open doors: jewelry that held a story, textiles colored in purple whose hue signaled prestige, and metalwork that mixed practicality and art. Along with goods, they carried ideas: a written alphabet that freed business records from memory, shipbuilding techniques that would be taught and adapted across the sea. These were small technologies with enormous effects, and they set the stage for a settlement that would grow into an empire. The traditional founding tale of Carthage is wrapped in myth, the story of a woman called Alyssa or Dido who fled a tragic past and negotiated the right to build a city with cunning modesty, asking for no more land than could be encompassed by a bullhide. Legends make memory vivid, but beneath the storytelling lay practical choices: a harbor with easy access to shipping lanes, fertile land behind the coast, and a position that balanced proximity to the western Mediterranean with protection from mainland powers. Those choices shaped the city's destiny because geography in the ancient world was destiny. A secure natural harbor could amplify a small community into a naval hub. Carthage's location allowed it to become not just a waypoint but a center of exchange, where goods, people, and ideas concentrated and multiplied. When Carthage grew, it did so by layering institution on institution. It began as a Phoenician trading colony but acquired its own identity through local governance, distinctive religious patterns, and a language that adapted Phoenician into something new, what later writers would call Punic. The city developed an oligarchic system where wealthy families directed commerce and diplomacy, balancing the demands of traders, craftsmen, and the growing class of landowners. These families invested in fleets and fortifications, and their decisions determined where merchants sailed, which colonies were founded, and how Carthage treated neighbors. It was not a democracy in the Greek sense, nor a kingdom with a single king. Instead, it was a networked power, an urban elite building an empire through contracts, marriages, and maritime reach. Carthage's harbor was a marvel of its time, a deliberate engineering of commerce. Ancient writers describe an inner circular basin with berths for ships and an outer port for merchants and naval operations, a design that made launching and maintaining a fleet more efficient than anywhere else in the western Mediterranean. The harbor was not merely practical, it was a statement. Carthage commanded the sea and invited the world to its docks. Around that harbor a city hummed, workshops clanking, markets shouting, and warehouses stacked with goods from distant lands. The physical layout supported a way of life where distance was diminished by ship and skill, and where wealth flowed from exchange just as surely as water flowed into the basin. You can hear the rhythm of a Carthaginian day by imagining the calls of sailors before dawn and the smell of resin and tar as ships were caulked and loaded. Craftsmen hammered bronze into tools while weavers dyed cloth in the famous purple that became synonymous with status. Markets opened with the light, bringing produce from the hinterland, grain, oil, wine, alongside glassware and beads from the east. The city reached outward through these exchanges, and each successful voyage fed more voyages. In this way, Carthage turned the sea into a marketplace and the marketplace into a means of power. Ships were the instruments of expansion, and Carthaginian sailors became more than mere crewmen. They were skilled navigators, technicians, and entrepreneurs. Shipyards employed hundreds, sometimes thousands, of workers from different cultural backgrounds, each contributing specialized skills. Those who built the hulls understood the behavior of timber and the stresses of waves, sailmakers knew how to cut cloth to catch a particular wind, and navigators accumulated knowledge of stars, currents, and coastal landmarks into practical instructions for long voyages. All of these talents were taught on the job, passed through apprenticeship and practice, until a fleet was not a collection of vessels but a mobile factory of power and influence. Behind the ships, a commercial network unfurled like a web across the Mediterranean. Carthage controlled nodes rather than contiguous territory at first, setting up trading posts and colonies where they made sense, a fishing town here, a fortified market there, a processing center near silver mines. This strategy minimized overextension while maximizing reach. It allowed Carthage to tap resources that lay far from its city walls: tin from the far west, silver and copper from Iberia, grain from fertile African valleys, textiles from the east, and to funnel them into markets where prices could be set by skillful bargaining and monopoly privileges. The network worked on many levels: economic, diplomatic, and military, as each worn quay and fortified outpost reinforced the others. Trade inevitably meant contact with people unlike themselves, and Carthage absorbed much from these encounters. The Berber communities inland, for example, were crucial partners and occasional rivals, providing grain, livestock, and local knowledge about routes and resources. In Iberia and on the islands, indigenous ways blended with Phoenician practices, creating hybrid cultures that became extensions of Carthage's influence. These cultural exchanges were not peaceful all the time, yet even conflict produced adaptation. Languages borrowed words, technologies traveled, and art forms mixed. This cultural pluralism became a strength because it allowed Carthage to integrate allies and workers without demanding total assimilation. Religion in Carthage reflected this blended world, combining core Phoenician beliefs with local accents and imperial needs. Priests officiated rituals to Baal, Hammon, and Tanit, deities who mattered to both city and countryside, and temples stood as centers not only of worship but also of social cohesion. Sacrifice and votive offerings were part of daily negotiation with fate, aiming for favorable winds, healthy harvests, and military success. Religious life also had an economic dimension. Temples owned land, received donations, and sometimes controlled lucrative trade activities, tying spiritual legitimacy to material power. In this way, belief and business became entangled, reinforcing the city's stability and its claim to rule. Agriculture underpinned the wealth of the maritime empire, even though ships and merchants often get more of the attention. Carthage invested in the land around it, developing farms and techniques to increase yields. Irrigation, terracing, and selective planting were not scientific in a modern sense, but based on local knowledge and trials, and they turned once marginal areas into productive estates. Large landowners, often members of the mercantile elite, organized agricultural production for local consumption and export. Olive oil and grain circulated as reliably as merchant silver. This agricultural base provided food for the city, fodder for horses, and a source of revenue that could be taxed or traded to support fleets and fortifications. Economically, Carthage was shrewd about securing sources of raw materials. Its interest in Iberia was driven by metals, silver to mint coin, and by goods, copper and tin to make bronze, and later in the second millennium, oil and agrarian products that could feed its growing population. Mines required organization, labor, and protection, so Carthage established a foothold that gradually changed from mere contacts to a more direct presence. Those mining enterprises were not just extraction projects, they became social and administrative centers where Carthaginian officials managed labor, security, and transport. Control of such resources made the city less dependent on chance profits and more capable of strategic planning. Part of the city's strategy was to convert trading relationships into political ones through treaties, marriages, and military pacts. Rather than relying solely on conquest, Carthage often bought loyalty by supporting local leaders or integrating elites into its trade networks. This approach allowed it to build an informal empire where allegiance flowed along commercial pathways. When force was necessary, the navy provided leverage. When diplomacy sufficed, merchants stitched alliances into place. The flexibility of these methods meant Carthage could adapt to the Mediterranean's shifting balance of power, expanding where possible and consolidating where necessary. Carthage's navy deserves a careful look because it was the engine of both defense and expansion. Unlike many land-based powers, Carthage recognized that to control sea lanes you needed not only ships but skilled maintenance, training, and a logistical system to supply crews and repair hulls. Naval crews were drawn from diverse populations, citizens, freedmen, mercenaries, and their experience lent Carthage an edge in timing and maneuver. The composition of the fleet changed over time as technology evolved, ships grew larger and more complex, and new tactics developed to meet new threats. Keeping that machine running required continuous investment, political will, and a culture that valued maritime expertise. What set Carthage apart was not merely the size of its fleet but the integration of commerce and warfare into a single mode of statecraft. Where some states separated merchant and military vessels, Carthage blurred the line. Commercial ships could be pressed into service in crises, and naval strength could be leveraged to impose trade restrictions or extract concessions. This synthesis made Carthage immensely flexible. A fleet could protect merchant convoys, blockade rival ports, or land troops on foreign shores. Each of those capabilities reinforced the others and expanded Carthage's influence without necessarily resorting to long-term occupations. The city's political structure evolved to manage these complexities. Powerful families formed a mercantile aristocracy that balanced private interests with public duties. Offices like the Sophites, the executive magistrates, handled civic administration while councils of elders debated policy and strategy. Military leaders could gain prominence through successful campaigns, but their authority was checked by civic institutions that sought to prevent any one person from monopolizing power. This system had friction, yet it created a durable mechanism for coordinating long-distance trade, naval logistics, and colonial administration all at once. Carthage's colonies were not empty symbols, they were functional extensions of the city's economy. Some colonies served as processing centers where raw materials were refined before transport, while others were fortresses protecting trade routes or hubs for local commerce. On Sicily, Carthage established communities that would be at the heart of long-lasting competition with Greek cities, and on Sardinia and Corsica its presence reshaped local politics. The pattern in each place looked similar, a strategic foothold that linked local production to Mediterranean markets, with the city at the center extracting value through taxes, monopolies, or direct control of key industries. Interaction with Greek cities taught Carthage both caution and opportunity. Greek colonies in the central Mediterranean offered trade but also posed a cultural challenge, their different political forms and rhetorical politics generating friction. Carthaginian responses varied, sometimes compromise, sometimes confrontation, and often nuanced diplomacy that secured commercial privileges without direct rule. Those encounters pushed Carthage to refine its diplomacy and to develop more sophisticated intelligence about the intentions of both friends and foes. Each tension hardened Carthage's skills as an imperial actor, making it more capable of managing diverse and distant dependencies. From the outset, the sea was also a conduit for ideas. Art motifs traveled, architectural forms were borrowed and adapted, and culinary tastes spread. Carthaginian artisans learned Greek styles and incorporated local motifs from North Africa and Iberia. The result was not homogeneous, it was complex and cosmopolitan, a visual language that signaled both local pride and Mediterranean belonging. City dwellers saw this hybrid culture when they walked the streets and entered temples, and it became a civic identity, Punic, inherited from Phoenicia but transformed in the context of North Africa and Empire. Merchandise arriving at Carthage was diverse: goods from the Levant, raw materials from inland Africa, metals from Iberia, even exotic items from beyond the Mediterranean as trade networks pushed northwestward and across channels. Each shipment required merchandising skills, assessment of quality, negotiation of price, and calculation of risk that turned individuals into economic strategists. Merchants kept ledgers, understood seasonal markets, and formed partnerships across generations. Their financial acumen underpinned the city's capacity to fund fleets, fortresses, and diplomatic missions. The city itself offered opportunities for innovation. Workshops in glassmaking produced colored vessels that found markets across the region, metalworkers turned ore into coins and luxury items, and textile industries wove fine fabrics that satisfied elite tastes. These industries did not exist in isolation, they formed a cluster that made Carthage an industrial center of its time. Skills transferred between workshops, craftsmen learned new techniques through contact with foreign artisans, and the demand from an empire created economies of scale that fed back into further growth. Coins tell a story of changing power because currency is a medium of exchange and a statement of sovereignty. Carthage began by relying on barter and weights, but as its economy grew more complex, coinage became a means to stabilize trade and project authority. The minting of coins allowed Carthaginian merchants to pay for ships and labor more easily and helped settle cross-cultural transactions. Images stamped on coins, symbols, mythic figures, and religious emblems also broadcasted identity and ambition across the markets where they circulated. Carthage's reach into Africa beyond its walls cannot be overstated. To feed and sustain a maritime empire, the city cultivated hinterlands through alliances and land development. Agrarian production ramped up to supply ports with staples and to export surpluses. Carthaginian elites invested in mills, storage, and the distribution networks that connected inland producers to maritime markets. In doing so, the city anchored its maritime mobility in terrestrial stability, creating a feedback loop where farmed wealth financed ships and ships secured farms. The city also relied on a diverse workforce that included free citizens, artisans, farmers, sailors, and a significant number of enslaved people. Slavery in the ancient world was a structured institution, and in Carthage it was integrated into commerce and domestic life. Enslaved labor appeared in mines, workshops, and households, providing a labor pool that supported economic expansion. This reality sits uneasily with romantic visions of maritime glory, but it is part of the historical truth of how empires scaled up production and sustained their infrastructures. Carthage's diplomacy developed practical tools: treaties with ports guaranteeing safe passage, agreements with local rulers to secure grain, and trade pacts that reduced tariffs in key markets. Diplomats were chosen for their experience at sea and in trade, not merely for their rhetoric. Their work was often unglamorous, mediating disputes among merchants, arranging port privileges, and negotiating the release of seized cargoes. Yet these efforts kept the economic engine running, and they demonstrate that empire building is as much about paperwork as it is about warfare. Military campaigns supplemented diplomacy when necessary, but Carthage preferred pragmatic engagements that secured trade rather than protracted land occupations. Armies were raised to protect colonies, escort convoys, or respond to piracy, and mercenary forces were an essential resource. Employing mercenaries brought flexibility, allowing Carthage to deploy forces without draining citizen manpower, but it required constant negotiation over pay and loyalty. These choices made Carthage adept at projecting force at sea and along selective points on land where strategic value justified a commitment of men and money. The skillful use of mercenary armies also reflected Carthage's cosmopolitan population, which included Greeks, Iberians, Libyans, and others who brought military knowledge and techniques. This melting pot allowed Carthage to integrate diverse fighting styles, hoplite-like infantry from Greek models, light cavalry from Numidian traditions, and specialized mountain troops from Iberia, into flexible field formations. Commanders learned to combine these elements depending on the terrain and goals, creating a pragmatic military culture that emphasized results over formal doctrine. It was a military bricolage, assembled from the resources of an empire rather than from a single national tradition. Carthage's mercantile networks extended far into the Atlantic, and its sailors were familiar, to some degree, with the coastlines of modern Spain and perhaps beyond. Trade with the Far West brought not only metals but also raw materials like tin, which was crucial to make bronze, and luxury items that could be re-exported across the Mediterranean. Operating in these waters required local knowledge and alliances with indigenous traders, so Carthage often worked through intermediary communities. The Atlantic connections reinforced Carthage's position as a bridge between different economic zones, allowing it to offer goods that competitors could not easily match. Knowledge management was another hidden strength. Carthage maintained records of navigational routes, pilot notes about harbors, seasonal weather patterns, and the capacities of distant markets. This information reduced risk and increased the predictability of trade. Merchants and officials stored this knowledge in archives and personal memory, circulating it through correspondence and personal networks. Such an institutional memory is one of the quiet engines of empire, sustaining long-distance operations that require repeated coordination over decades. The city's artisans affected not only commerce but also the aesthetic life of the Mediterranean. Carthaginian pottery styles, metalwork, and jewelry adapted motifs from neighboring cultures and recombined them into locally recognizable forms. Temples were adorned with reliefs and statues that blended Phoenician iconography with African and Iberian elements, and private houses displayed imported goods alongside local crafts. This material culture signaled a society comfortable with borrowing, confident enough to assimilate, and ambitious in its expression of status. Language played a role in binding the empire. Punic evolved from Phoenician into a linguistic vehicle that carried legal codes, commercial contracts, religious texts, and everyday conversation. It became the lingua franca in many colonial centers, even where other tongues remained in use, because language simplified transactions and enabled coordination. Yet Carthage also used multilingualism to its advantage. Local officials could negotiate in native tongues, interpreters facilitated exchanges, and the city's cosmopolitan elites often mastered Greek and other languages to expand their diplomatic options. As the city grew richer and more complex, social life became layered and new cultural norms emerged. Elite households enjoyed banquets and patronized the arts, while popular festivities marked agricultural cycles and religious rites. Public architecture, baths, marketplaces, temples, provided spaces where civic identity could be staged, and processions reinforced the bonds among citizens and allies. Social mobility existed in the forms of new wealth from trade and the incorporation of foreign elites, allowing some outsiders to assimilate into Carthaginian society through marriage and service. Carthage's administrative practices were pragmatic and adaptive. Officials managed taxation, port regulations, and colonial affairs, often delegating authority to local hands while reserving strategic control for the city. This system enabled swift responses to threats or opportunities, but it relied on trustworthy agents and a steady flow of information. When corruption or miscommunication occurred, the state adapted through legal reforms or the appointment of special commissioners to restore order and confidence. Governance was a series of practical compromises aimed at keeping the machinery of empire operating smoothly. Merchant families invested in long-term ventures, sometimes establishing private houses that functioned like banks, offering credit and insurance for risky voyages. These institutions underpinned the economy, allowing merchants to finance fleets and absorb losses from shipwrecks or piracy. The provision of credit also tied distant traders to Carthage's financial circuits, creating dependencies that consolidated commercial influence. Financial networks thus paralleled and reinforced maritime routes, making economic control an instrument of political power. Carthage's cultural richness is perhaps easiest to see in burial practices and monuments, where the living expressed their values and connections. Tombs demonstrated social status and cosmopolitan taste, packed with grave goods from across the sea, pottery from Greece, jewelry from the Levant, and locally made items that used international formulas. Funerary steles bore inscriptions in Punic and sometimes Greek, a testament to the multicultural identities of the deceased and their families. These practices show how private memory and public expression work together to sustain an elite that saw itself as both local and Mediterranean. The rise of Carthage also depended on mastering logistics in ways that often go unnoticed: the storage of grain to weather bad harvests, the maintenance of naval supplies like pitch and rope, and the systems to feed troops on distant expeditions. Ports acted like modern multimodal hubs, receiving, processing, and redistributing cargoes with a rhythm that required coordination. These logistical webs allowed Carthage to act quickly in crises and to sustain prolonged operations that lesser powers could not. Where rivals stumbled for want of supplies, Carthage usually had plans to replenish and reinforce its positions. Carthage's approach to law and order balanced local autonomy with central oversight. Local magistrates handled everyday disputes, while central institutions intervened in cases that threatened trade or security. Contracts and commercial law were detailed enough to be enforceable across long distances, and legal archives kept precedents that helped resolve recurring problems. The predictability of justice mattered immensely in commercial affairs, because traders needed confidence that agreements would be honored when ships crossed hundreds of miles of sea. Families and patronage formed the social network that lubricated political and economic transactions. Powerful families secured loyalty through marriages, loans, and the granting of commercial favors. In turn, lesser families gained protection and access to opportunities. Patron-client relationships knit together a society where favors and obligations were a public currency, and this interpersonal glue often determined who led expeditions, who commanded fleets, and who became magistrates. These patterns made Carthage resilient by creating a web of mutual interests aligned with the city's prosperity. The city's workshops were also laboratories of improvisation where craftsmen repurposed materials and adapted designs to market demands. When supplies of one metal ran low, smiths learned to alloy different metals to achieve acceptable strength and appearance. Glassmakers experimented with colorants and techniques, sometimes discovering methods that were later adopted by others. This capacity to innovate on the fly mattered because markets rewarded novelty and quality. Those who could deliver attractive goods at reasonable cost found success and prestige. Education in Carthage favored practical skills more than abstract speculation, at least for merchant families. Boys learned to read ledgers, calculate weights and measures, and understand contracts. Girls learned household management and craft skills. For those entering religious life, knowledge of ritual and liturgy was transmitted through priestly families, and for those joining fleets, seamanship and navigation were taught through apprenticeship. Formal schooling existed but was blended with hands-on training, ensuring that knowledge served the needs of commerce and administration. The marine environment also shaped daily religion and superstition. Sailors kept talismans and observed omens because lives depended on minor calculations of risk, when to leave port, how to interpret a wind, which coastline to approach at dusk. Temples to sea gods offered rites for sailors and merchants, seeking protection for voyages and gratitude for safe returns. Rituals were pragmatic. They addressed the uncertainties of ocean travel with symbolic acts that reassured communities and reinforced social cohesion. This cultural habit of aligning ritual with enterprise helped Carthage manage the intangible risks of maritime life. Carthage's expansion into the western Mediterranean changed local ecologies. Farming in new areas altered landscapes, and mining reshaped hills and river valleys. These transformations had long-term consequences for local populations, sometimes improving standards of living through trade and sometimes producing ecological strain. Carthage had to weigh economic gains against the cost of exploiting resources too rapidly, a problem not unknown to empires that later followed similar paths. Balancing extraction and sustainability became a practical, if uneven, concern for administrators overseeing far-flung operations. As the city matured, craft guilds and trade associations emerged to regulate quality, stabilize prices, and negotiate with the state. Artisans formed networks that preserved secret techniques and maintained collective bargaining power, shaping the economics of production. Such organizations also helped standardize practices across colonies, allowing Carthage to offer reliably produced goods in distant markets. The institutionalization of craft and trade practices smoothed the rough edges of commerce and made the city's exports more competitive abroad. Carthage's urban planning reflected a concern for both defense and commerce, with walls and towers protecting the city while markets and docks invited trade. Residential quarters exhibited social stratification, with wealthy merchants occupying spacious houses with private courtyards and poorer artisans and laborers living in denser neighborhoods. Public spaces facilitated exchange and civic rituals, while sacred precincts anchored communal identity. The city's physical contours were therefore a material map of its social and economic life. Networking with other Mediterranean powers was both necessary and risky. Treaties with Etruscan cities and Greek polities opened markets but also invited jealousy and rivalry. Carthage navigated these relationships with skill, sometimes supporting one side in local conflicts to secure trade advantages and sometimes withdrawing to avoid expensive entanglements. Its diplomacy was pragmatic and transactional, aimed at preserving commercial freedom and naval superiority rather than ideological dominance. The growth of Carthage provoked responses both hostile and admiring from neighbors. Some saw a rival to be contained, while others found in Carthage a partner who could supply desired goods and provide security against common threats. Rivalries with Greek colonies in Sicily and later tensions with emergent Roman power were born of overlapping interests, control of trade routes, access to resources, and influence over strategic islands. Understanding Carthage therefore requires seeing it as part of a network of competing cities in which balance and calculation mattered as much as brute force. When crises occurred, famine, plague, pirate raids, the city relied on communal institutions and private resources to respond. Grain stores were opened, ships were dispatched to hunt pirates, and diplomatic envoys negotiated temporary peace. These responses revealed the strengths and weaknesses of a maritime empire reliant on distant supplies and complex logistics. Crises forced innovation as much as they tested endurance, and Carthage's capacity to withstand shocks contributed to its longevity as a power. The culture of risk-taking in Carthage extended beyond commerce to colonization and military ventures. Entrepreneurs financed expeditions into uncharted waters, and commanders took chances to secure strategic footholds. Sometimes these gambles paid off handsomely in new resources and trade routes. Other times they resulted in losses that were absorbed through collective credit and resilience. This appetite for calculated risk was not reckless but disciplined by experience, networks of credit, and a legal framework that distributed the burden of failure. Carthage's legal and moral codes reflected a commercial ethic. Contracts were honored, debts were enforced, but there was also a sense of reciprocity that bound trading partners. Gift exchanges and hospitality created bonds that facilitated commerce in a world without centralized enforcement across seas. Reputation mattered immensely, for a city's merchants thrived only if they could rely on the promises of others. Thus, honor and profit were often two sides of the same civic coin. Over decades and centuries, Carthage accumulated institutional memory that turned experience into a strategic advantage. Veteran captains trained new commanders, seasoned merchants taught apprentices, and archives preserved port logs and contracts. This continuity allowed the city to learn from mistakes and leverage successes, maintaining a level of sophistication that surprised many contemporaries. The city's long view enabled investments that transcended a single generation, harbors, fortifications, and trade relationships planned for decades rather than months. Material culture continued to evolve as artisans absorbed influences and the market demanded novelty. Ceramic styles shifted, jewelry techniques advanced, and luxury goods transformed in response to tastes across the Mediterranean. These shifts signal not decline or loss of identity but adaptation and creativity, as Carthage kept its finger on the pulse of consumers from Sicily to the Iberian coast. Creative industries flourished precisely because there was a demand for the new and the fashionable, and Carthaginian entrepreneurs delivered. Civic religion and public festivals served as instruments of cohesion for a diverse population. Sacred calendars synchronized agricultural cycles with public life, and festivals provided occasions for political reconciliation and communal pride. Processions and public feasts reinforced social hierarchies but also allowed for displays of generosity that strengthened bonds between elites and the broader populace. These rituals were not mere spectacle, they were the social glue that made an urban empire function on a daily basis. The role of women in Carthaginian society merits attention because they participated in commerce, religious life, and family strategies. Elite women might manage estates, oversee textile production, and engage in patronage, while priestesses held significant positions in cultic practices. Women's economic contributions through household industries and market trade made them active participants in urban life. Their roles were complex and varied, challenging simplistic assumptions about gender in the ancient world. Carthage's artisanship in shipbuilding combined efficiency with innovation, adapting hull forms and rigging to the demands of both trade and war. Shipwrights experimented with plank fastening and keel design, learning from successes and failures to create vessels suited for the Mediterranean's variable seas. The naval architecture was not static, it responded to changing tactical needs, resource availability, and the scales of operation. This technical dynamism supported the city's maritime supremacy because ships had to be reliable across decades of service. As Carthage's empire matured, its cultural identity crystallized into a civic pride that acknowledged Phoenician roots while celebrating Punic distinctiveness. Public monuments, religious rites, and civic discourses reinforced a narrative of prosperity earned through skill and prudence. Citizens and subjects alike took part in a shared sense of belonging that justified the city's dominance and encouraged cooperation. That civic self-understanding was essential because empire is sustained not only by force but by narratives of legitimacy and purpose. Trade routes were policed by convoys and by negotiation with coastal communities who benefited from stable commerce. Pirates were a real threat, and Carthage invested in both preventive diplomacy, paying off potential raiders, and in punitive naval actions when necessary. This combination of carrots and sticks kept many routes safe for merchants and created a relatively predictable environment for long-distance trade. The ability to secure seas amplified the city's economic potential because merchants could plan with reasonable confidence. Carthaginian law regulated commercial practice in ways that balanced freedom and control. Port dues, tariffs, and standards for weights and measures ensured that trade could be orderly, and disputes were resolved through courts that specialized in commercial litigation. These legal frameworks made Carthage an attractive partner for distant traders who needed predictability. The city's legal infrastructure thus became part of its comparative advantage in the Mediterranean economy. The relationship with inland peoples was both economic and political, as Carthage needed access to agricultural products and raw materials while also facing occasional rebellion and competition. Strategies included alliance building with local chieftains, intermarriage with influential families, and the establishment of fortified towns to secure trade routes. These approaches created a patchwork of influence that stabilized supply lines and integrated economies across diverse terrains. A maritime empire without a secure hinterland would be vulnerable, and Carthage invested heavily in protecting what fed its fleets. Luxury consumption helped define elite status and fueled production in specialized sectors. Elite demand for imported wine, precious metals, and exotic textiles created a market for merchants and craftsmen who could satisfy these tastes. Elite households displayed their wealth through inscribed artifacts and imported goods, while public generosity through donations to temples reinforced status while supporting civic life. The interplay between private display and public philanthropy shaped social hierarchies and reinforced the economic cycles that made empire possible. Carthage's intellectual life included practical knowledge in navigation, agriculture, metallurgy, and administration, transmitted through apprenticeship and mentorship. While philosophical speculation played a smaller role than in some Greek cities, technical knowledge was highly valued because it produced tangible results. Scholars in the modern sense may have been rare, but the city cultivated experts whose craft translated directly into civic advantage. This practical orientation toward knowledge shaped institutions and policies and focused energies on usable innovations. The rise of Carthage was not inevitable. It required a series of fortunate choices and continuous adaptation to shifting circumstances. Geography provided opportunity but not destiny, and the city's leaders had to make hard choices about resource allocation, colonial strategy, and diplomatic posture. Mistakes were made, and failures were absorbed, but the city's capacity to learn and reorganize allowed it to persist and to grow. In this sense, the story of Carthage is a story of institutional creativity and pragmatic leadership. Even as pressures mounted from competing powers and internal tensions stubbornly persisted, Carthage's maritime empire continued to be defined by its networks of ships, markets, families, and alliances. These networks were resilient because they were redundant and multifaceted. If one route closed, others opened. If one colony faltered, another could take its place. This redundancy was no accident. It was a deliberate feature of a strategy designed to weather storms both literal and political. Carthage did not rely on a single pillar but on multiple supports braided together. Looking back from the vantage point of centuries, the rise of Carthage reveals a pattern of pragmatic innovation and cultural synthesis. The city transformed Phoenician mercantile skill into an imperial system that managed to knit together distant peoples through commerce and force when necessary. Its maritime expertise, administrative flexibility, and economic institutions together created an empire that dominated much of the Western Mediterranean for centuries. That story of growth is complex and full of contradictions, but it is also a testament to human ingenuity in organizing resources across space and time. To follow Carthage's ascent is to trace the development of an early globalizer, a city that used sea power to integrate markets, spread technologies, and establish political influence without necessarily conquering vast territories. It demonstrates how maritime empires can be constructed through networks rather than continuous land empires, and how economic logic can become a form of political power. The lessons of Carthage resonate because they show how connectivity, adaptability, and a pragmatic mix of diplomacy and force can produce a civilization whose impact endures long after its fall. And so, as the sun sets over a sea once sailed by Carthaginian merchants and captains, the silhouette of their achievements remains, harbors carved into the coastline, artifacts scattered across distant shores, and the linguistic and cultural traces absorbed by successive generations. The rise of Carthage from Phoenician traders to maritime empire is a story of people who turned the Mediterranean into a living network of exchange, where ambitions were carried on the backs of ships and where a city's influence could stretch across the horizon. Their legacy invites us to listen to the sea and to appreciate the quiet work of building an empire out of trade, craft, and the mastery of movement across water. Carthage was built by people who trusted the sea more than land. Subscribe and tell us in the comments what moves you more, their courage to chase the horizon or their skill to build a world from the waves. Imagine a city of sun-bright stone and brine-scented air, a city that rose from the trading outposts of the eastern Mediterranean and made itself into a dominion that locked horns with the rising power on the Italian peninsula. That city was Carthage, founded by Phoenician settlers who brought with them a seafaring skill and a commercial shrewdness so refined that it became a way of life. The story of Carthage is inseparable from the sea, and the sea is the stage on which its rivalries with Rome would be played out for generations. To understand the wars that followed, one must first understand what made Carthage compelling and dangerous to Rome. Carthage was not a mere collection of ships and markets, it was an empire of networks, a web of colonies and trading relationships that stretched from the coasts of North Africa to Iberia, through Sardinia and Sicily, and along the southern shores of the Mediterranean. Its wealth was visible in its coinage, its temples, and the architecture of its ports, and that wealth funded both commerce and war. Carthage grew from joined communities of Phoenician settlers who maintained ties to Tyre and Sidon but soon established a distinct identity that scholars later called Punic. Their language retained Semitic rhythms, their gods were local interpretations of Eastern deities, and their merchants adapted new markets into an ever-expanding empire of exchange. They balanced maritime trade with agricultural hinterlands, extracting grain, olive oil, and metals, and they did so using a cosmopolitan model that could coexist with diverse populations under their rule. One of the features that set Carthage apart was its navy. The Carthaginian shipbuilders and sailors turned vessels into instruments of statecraft, building fleets that could protect trade lanes and project power across long distances. Naval dominance was both a defensive necessity and an offensive opportunity. It allowed Carthage to secure colonies, dispatch mercenary armies, and intervene in the affairs of islands like Sicily where Greek and indigenous communities jostled for influence. Rome, by contrast, began as an inland power, a city-state on the Tiber whose early wars were fought against neighboring peoples of Italy rather than across the sea. Romans were farmers and soldiers first, and their expansion across the Italian peninsula unfolded through alliances, colonization, and the assimilation of conquered peoples into a Roman political framework. When Rome looked out toward the wider Mediterranean, it did so with a mixture of ambition and the unbending will to control the resources and strategic positions it considered vital. Sicily became the flashpoint where two very different models of power met. The island was a mosaic of Greek city-states, native Sicilian kingdoms, and strategically placed ports, prized for grain, timber, and world-spanning trade routes. Carthage had long been present through a network of colonies and garrisons, while Greek cities had their own fleets and interests. The friction of competing claims and local conflicts set the island on a course toward a larger collision. The First Punic War began as a dispute over a small mercantile hub that would come to symbolize the wider schism between Carthage and Rome. When Mamertine mercenaries seized the Sicilian city of Messana and alarmed Syracuse, both Rome and Carthage were drawn into the struggle, each claiming a right to influence the island. Rome's decision to intervene marked its transformation into a Mediterranean power and led to a confrontation with a Carthaginian navy that had decades of dominance under its belt. Rome was initially out of its element at sea, and yet it improvised, borrowing design principles from captured ships and applying Roman ingenuity to naval warfare. The introduction of the corvus, a boarding bridge that allowed Roman infantry to turn sea battles into land fights aboard enemy vessels, exemplified this adaptiveness. This rough but effective device neutralized some of Carthage's advantages and allowed Rome to win crucial engagements, demonstrating that military innovation can be born from necessity. The First Punic War dragged on for 2 decades, wearing down both sides through blockades, sieges, and costly naval maneuvers. Battles at sea and sieges on land produced a war of attrition whose toll was measured in ships, men, and treasure. Carthage's reliance on mercenary forces would become both a strength and a vulnerability, as the composition of its armies changed from citizen levies to hired soldiers with loyalties that could be fickle. Remarkable among the episodes of the First War were the long sieges and the grim persistence of both sides. The Romans learned the art of shipbuilding on a massive scale, producing fleets to challenge Carthaginian control and to safeguard supply lines. Even in defeat, Rome gained knowledge and experience that would harden into institutions and practices, while Carthage felt the strain of prolonged conflict on its finances and its colonies. When the war finally concluded, Rome imposed terms that were punitive and transformative. Carthage lost Sicily, the first of its overseas possessions to pass into Roman hands, and was forced to pay heavy indemnities. That loss shook Carthage and spurred it to look elsewhere for resources and opportunity, turning westward toward the mineral-rich and agriculturally abundant lands of Iberia. The Barcid family, a powerful Carthaginian dynasty, would become the architects of this new direction. Hamilcar Barca and his son-in-law, Hasdrubal, established a Carthaginian stronghold in Iberia, founding new cities and securing mines that would replenish Carthage's coffers. The Barcids also cultivated a base of loyal troops and a political platform that would eventually produce Hannibal, whose name would become synonymous with audacity and military genius. Hannibal was born into a world shaped by the defeat of the First Punic War and the dreams of Barcid resurgence in Iberia. His family's resentment toward Rome, reinforced by tales of loss and vows of revenge, embedded itself into his upbringing. From an early age, Hannibal absorbed lessons in strategy, leadership, and the ruthlessness that the Barcids believed necessary to confront Rome on terms that Carthage could control. While Carthage expanded in Iberia, Rome grew uneasy with a foreign power consolidating across the sea. Roman senators debated the threat, and local Italian allies worried about the security of trade and grain supplies. The delicate balance of treaties, trading rights, and political influence began to fray as both powers tested each other's boundaries through diplomacy and occasional skirmishes. The Second Punic War erupted when provocations in Iberia and Sardinia escalated beyond local disputes. The Roman response to Carthaginian moves, coupled with entangling alliances and demands for the withdrawal of troops, set off a chain reaction. Hannibal's decision to attack Saguntum, a city nominally under Roman protection, became the casus belli that drove the two powers back into full-scale war. Hannibal's campaign in Italy remains one of the most dramatic military episodes in ancient history. Eschewing the more predictable Sea or North African theater, he led a multinational army out of Iberia, across the Pyrenees, through Gaul, and over the Alps, arriving in Italy with elephants, cavalry, and veterans hardened by years of service. His crossing of the Alps is often described in cinematic terms, but the reality was a painstaking progression of terrain, weather, and logistic improvisation that tested the resolve of both men and beasts. Once in Italy, Hannibal did not underestimate the power of psychological warfare. He sought to shake Rome's alliances by courting discontented Italian cities, showing clemency where praise and protection might win followers, and striking decisive blows on the field to demonstrate Rome's vulnerability. His victories at Trebia and Lake Trasimene were tactical masterpieces that exploited terrain, surprise, and superior cavalry maneuvers. Then came Cannae, a battle that transformed military thinking for centuries. Hannibal's forces, though often outnumbered, used a double envelopment that smashed the Roman legions into a crushing defeat. The scene was horrific. Roman formations folded in on themselves, casualties mounted, and the shock sent waves through the Roman political and social order. Rome's losses were catastrophic, and the city confronted the terrifying possibility that its hegemony in Italy could be undone. Yet Rome refused to capitulate. Political debate in the city produced leaders who advocated caution and others who demanded aggressive counterattacks, but above all there was a communal determination to endure. Fabius Maximus, who advised a strategy of avoidance and attrition, became a symbol of the pragmatic response that slowed Hannibal's momentum. The Fabian strategy bought Rome time to rebuild forces, secure fortifications, and prevent Hannibal from turning his battlefield triumphs into a sustained strategic conquest of the peninsula. Amid the Italian campaigns, the conflict broadened. Rome opened a new front in Hispania, targeting the Barcid base and depriving Carthage of its Iberian riches. The young Publius Cornelius Scipio, later Africa's scourge, cut his teeth in Spain and honed a strategy that combined local alliances with disciplined Roman troop movements. Slowly, Rome began to choke Carthage's external lines of support by threatening its supply of troops and treasure from the west. Scipio's evolution into Scipio Africanus marked a turning point. He studied Hannibal's tactics, learned to fight on different terms, and eventually took the audacious step of proposing an invasion of North Africa itself to draw Hannibal away from Italy. Rome's willingness to strike at the heart of Carthage's territory forced a strategic pivot that tested the very survival of the Carthaginian state and its people's endurance. When the theater shifted to Africa, the war reached a climactic phase. Scipio landed forces and won support among local rulers who were eager to break Carthaginian dominance. The gathering confrontation culminated in the Battle of Zama, where Roman and Numidian cavalry, combined with tactical innovations, secured a decisive victory that finally broke Carthage's military backbone. Rome demonstrated that persistence, adaptation, and strategic depth could overcome even the most formidable adversary. The treaty that followed was humiliating and transforming. Carthage surrendered its navy, ceded overseas territories, paid massive indemnities, and accepted strict limits on its military capabilities. The loss of Iberia and Sardinia, together with a reduced influence over Sicily, meant that Carthage's imperial reach had been dramatically curtailed. Rome emerged as the dominant Mediterranean power, but the war's consequences were mutual. Rome now had an unprecedented interest in Mediterranean stability and control. Carthage's political life after the Second Punic War was fraught. The city rebuilt its economy, paid its debts, and began to reassert itself in commerce while carefully avoiding formal military expansion that would provoke Roman ire. Yet memories of war and the humiliation of defeat lingered, especially among the Barcid faction and others who longed for autonomy of action and dignity in the face of Roman oversight. Within Rome, the victory emboldened imperial appetites. Senators debated the nature of foreign policy as a question of security and profit, and the idea that Rome should police and shape the Mediterranean began to crystallize. Yet the Roman approach was also pragmatic. For a time they permitted Carthage to exist as a mercantile power under tight restrictions, seeing the city as economically useful and political containment as manageable. But containment proved difficult to enforce. Carthage maintained wealth and resilience, and it rebuilt fortifications, trade networks, and agricultural productivity that kept the city relevant. Roman observers watched with suspicion as Carthage once again amassed resources and diplomatic connections. Under the surface, old resentments and newer anxieties simmered, setting the stage for a final, tragic confrontation. The Third Punic War arose from a mixture of Roman fear, political pressure, and opportunism. Carthage engaged in military actions deemed transgressive by its treaty obligations, and Rome responded with demands and ultimatums that the Carthaginians resisted. The Roman statesman Cato the Elder pushed the narrative that Carthage must be destroyed, ending his speeches with the phrase that Carthage must be razed, and his persistence reflected a broader sentiment among many Romans that a recurring threat required final resolution. When Roman forces finally marched on Carthage, the siege that followed was relentless. For years the city withstood blockades, bombardments, and pitched assaults, employing all the defensive skills that generations of Carthaginians had developed. Inside the walls, civilians and soldiers endured hunger, disease, and the terror of approaching defeat, while the defenders fought with a grim determination born of a desire to preserve their home and way of life. The fall of Carthage was a scene of devastation and legend. Roman troops breached walls, fought in the narrow streets, and eventually razed temples and markets to the ground. Ancient sources described fires that consumed grand houses and sacred precincts, and the systematic destruction of urban fabric. The surviving Carthaginian population was, according to some accounts, sold into slavery, while the city's ruins became a warning to others who might resist Roman supremacy. Scholars debate the scale and exact nature of the destruction, but the symbolic impact is indisputable. The Third War left Carthage, once a vibrant cosmopolitan center, effectively erased as a political entity and repurposed within the Roman world. Yet the memory of Carthage, the stories of maritime prowess, the tactical brilliance of Hannibal, and the city's tragic end, did not vanish with its walls. It was absorbed into Roman narratives and later retold by generations that alternately admired and vilified the fallen rival. Carthage's system of governance helps explain both its strengths and vulnerabilities. Unlike Rome's republican structures that gradually incorporated elites into a shared civic identity, Carthage operated as a commercial oligarchy where merchant families and powerful commanders influenced policy through councils and elected officials known as suffetes. This system allowed rapid decisions in trade and maritime policy but sometimes produced factionalism and an over-reliance on hired soldiers. Mercenaries played a crucial role in Carthaginian armies, supplying infantry and cavalry from varied backgrounds: Libyans, Numidians, Greeks, Iberians, and others. This diversity gave Carthage tactical flexibility and a range of military skills, yet it also introduced fragility into loyalty and cohesion, especially when pay faltered or political directives conflicted with local interests. In contrast, Roman legions relied on citizen soldiers and client communities whose investment in Rome's political order took a different form. Religion and ritual shaped the public and private life of Carthage. Temples to gods like Baal, Hammon, and Tanit stood at the city's heart, and offerings and vows underscored a civic culture that read the gods' favor as essential to prosperity. Rituals were intertwined with commercial contracts and civic ceremonies, and priests served as conduits between the divine and the mundane. Controversy over practices such as child sacrifice has long colored perceptions of Punic religion, and modern scholars continue to debate the evidence and its interpretation, arguing for nuance and avoidance of simplistic moral judgments placed by hostile ancient writers. Economically, Carthage harnessed a mixed model of agriculture and trade. Its hinterlands were cultivated with intensive methods that produced grain and olive oil for local consumption and export. It built trade routes that moved silver, tin, and other raw materials from Iberia and the Atlantic trade into markets across the Levant and beyond. Markets at its harbors were vibrant ecosystems where languages, goods, and ideas flowed as freely as the ships that arrived with the dawn tide. The physical layout of Carthage was a reflection of its maritime identity. Ancient writers and later excavations described the double harbor, an outer commercial port and an inner military harbor, where fleets could shelter and ships could be serviced. The Kathan, or man-made basin, was lined with workshops, warehouses, and docking facilities designed for rapid replenishment and repair. These engineered features allowed Carthage to project force and sustain trade efficiently, a testament to the city's technical and organizational sophistication. Carthaginian society was cosmopolitan, absorbing peoples and customs from across its empire. Greek merchants and artisans mixed with Punic administrators, Berber farmers, and Iberian miners. This cultural amalgam produced hybrid art styles, religious syncretism, and a pragmatic tolerance that supported commerce. Yet social stratification existed, with powerful merchant families at one end and enslaved people and poor laborers at the other, reminders that prosperity often masked deep inequalities. Rome's rise to Mediterranean dominance changed the texture of trade and diplomacy. Where Carthage had relied on maritime networks and negotiated spheres of influence, Roman policy increasingly asserted a law-based international order backed by legions. Treaties and alliances became instruments of Roman enforcement, and the social and political fabric of regions under Rome's adapted to a hegemonic center that demanded obeisance and levied taxes. The naval technologies and tactics used by both powers reveal how innovation and adaptation shaped outcomes. Carthage excelled at shipbuilding, outfitting vessels with better sails and rigging suited to long-range cruising and rapid transport of goods. Rome, forced into naval contention, adapted by upscaling ship production and inventing devices like the corvus to compensate for its initial lack of seamanship, a decision that had far-reaching effects on the conduct of the First Punic War. Logistics mattered as much as tactics. Supplying armies across the sea required ports, stores, and secure lines, and Carthage's established harbors gave it an edge in provisioning expeditions. Rome's experience in moving troops across Italian terrain and its later establishment of strategic colonies allowed it to sustain long campaigns inland. The ability to refit, reprovision, and rotate troops turned the tide in long wars where attrition was a decisive factor. Diplomacy and client relationships formed another axis of power. Both Carthage and Rome cultivated allies, local kings, tribes, and city-states, whose loyalty could tilt the balance in skirmishes and supply networks. Rome's model often involved offering citizenship or legal privileges to allies, thereby knitting them into a Roman order that grew self-reinforcing. Carthage's model remained more transactional, offering protection and trade benefits in return for tribute and military support. The perception of Hannibal across the ancient world is a study in paradox. For some, he was a barbarian scourge, a scourge upon civilized customs, and for others, he was a brilliant tactician and a man of singular courage. Roman writers vilified and admired him in equal measure. Later historians extolled his campaigns as lessons in military art. His image, amplified by the drama of crossing the Alps and outmaneuvering larger Roman armies, turned him into a figure both dreaded and respected. Hannibal's character was complex, a commander willing to take massive risks in pursuit of strategic advantage, yet also a leader who understood the value of alliances and political persuasion. He sought to win over Italian allies by promoting autonomy and clemency, yet he lacked the political framework and reinforcements necessary to translate battlefield successes into the total collapse of Roman power. Therein lay a paradox of military genius. Tactical mastery could not always substitute for political infrastructure and logistic depth. The wars between Rome and Carthage induced social change across the Mediterranean. Citizens, soldiers, and slaves were displaced, economies shifted to wartime production, and cultural exchange accelerated as armies moved across territories. The reward and punishment of war had social consequences that went beyond political borders. As new cities rose, populations migrated, and the labor systems essential to Mediterranean agriculture and industry recalibrated to new realities. Archaeology has gradually recovered the material life of Punic cities, illuminating the textures of daily existence and the layered histories beneath modern landscapes. Excavations have found sanctuaries, residential quarters, and industrial complexes that attest to the sophistication of Punic urbanism. The archaeological record also complicates simplistic narratives of barbarism. It shows a people engaged in commerce, artistry, and civic organization whose decline was as much about geopolitics as about internal failure. Memory and myth surrounding Carthage are complex and often shaped by its conquerors. Roman accounts accentuated Carthage's worst attributes while celebrating Rome's triumphs, a rhetorical strategy that justified expansion and suppression. Later retellings, by Greek, Roman, and modern authors, oscillate between moral condemnation and begrudging admiration, reflecting the persistent fascination with a rival whose destiny was both instructive and cautionary. The economic calculus of empire reveals why Rome targeted Carthage so persistently. Control over grain, metal resources, and maritime routes translated into power and security, and Carthage's position threatened Rome's interests in these areas. Rome's capacity to mobilize wider resources and to impose fiscal discipline across its domains made sustained warfare a feasible strategy, even if the short-term costs were enormous. Technological exchanges occurred alongside conflict. In building ships, forging weapons, and organizing supply systems, both cultures learned from one another and from other Mediterranean peoples. Captured technologies were studied, adapted, and sometimes improved, with the result that warfare and commerce became shared arenas of innovation. Such cross-pollination complicates any binary of barbarism and civilization and instead frames the Mediterranean as a laboratory of continuous improvement and hybrid practices. Carthage's end reshaped the political map of North Africa and the Western Mediterranean. With Carthage neutralized, Rome annexed lands and eventually turned them into provinces that fed Rome's growing urban populations. The economic center of gravity shifted, and the patterns of colonial settlement, towns, roads, and agricultural estates reoriented the region toward Roman administrative norms and cultural influences. Yet elements of Punic culture persisted beneath the Roman overlay. Language, religious practice, and architectural traditions continued in pockets, blending with Roman institutions over time. New Carthage, a Roman colony established on the ruins, bore testimony to this complex layering where destruction and continuity coexisted. Cultural memory lived in rituals, place names, and local customs even as Roman law and architecture imposed new forms of civic life. The psychological dimensions of the wars cannot be overstated. For Rome, Carthage represented an existential threat that required extraordinary measures to neutralize, and for Carthage, Rome was an expanding juggernaut that jeopardized survival and autonomy. The emotions, fear, hatred, desperation, resolve, driven by these perceptions informed decisions that reshaped the Mediterranean world in fundamental ways. In the centuries that followed, historians, strategists, and statesmen returned again and again to the lessons of the Punic Wars. Hannibal's battlefield maneuvers were studied in military schools, Kenny became shorthand for tactical encirclement, and Zama illustrated the importance of adaptability in combined arms warfare. The conflicts enriched military theory with real-world case studies that echoed across later epochs, even as the human cost remained a sobering backdrop. Beyond tactics, the Punic Wars also clarified lessons about the relationship between economic power and military strength. Carthage's wealth was not enough without a political and military system capable of turning that wealth into sustained strategic advantage. Rome's institutional capacity to mobilize manpower, organize logistics, and incorporate allies into a durable framework proved decisive, an observation that carries relevance for the study of empires beyond antiquity. The ruins of Carthage, the coins recovered from shipwrecks, the fragments of inscriptions and religious stelae, together create a mosaic of a civilization both vibrant and vulnerable. These artifacts give voice to a people whose story did not end neatly with razed walls and burned bazaars, but rather entered a long afterlife in memory, law, and culture. The archaeological record invites us to reconstruct a more textured narrative that respects Carthage's agency and complexity. The human stories within these conflicts deserve attention. Merchants who watched their wares sink to the seabed when a galley went down, women who kept households together during sieges, soldiers who endured freezing passes in the Alps, and children who grew up in the shadow of imperial rivalry. War reshaped lives as much as borders, and the intimate costs are often hidden behind grand strategic narratives. To listen to the story of Carthage is also to listen for those quieter, painful notes. Carthage's relations with local African peoples show another dimension of its imperial model. The city negotiated, fought, and intermarried with Berber tribes and cultivated alliances that sometimes resembled protectorates and other times resembled client kingdoms. These relationships were not static. They changed according to economic needs, military pressures, and the shifting balance between local autonomy and centralized control. The role of economic extraction, mines in Iberia, grain from Africa, timber from Sardinia, highlights the interdependence of military and commercial imperatives. Control of resources fueled fleets and armies, and losing them transformed strategic calculations. For Carthage, the loss of Iberian silver and manpower after the Second Punic War was a wound that took decades to heal and ultimately constrained the city's capacity to challenge Rome again. How the ancients recorded these wars also matters. Roman historians like Livy and Polybius presented narratives shaped by their times and audiences, blending eyewitness testimony, speeches, and dramatic reconstruction. Polybius, writing with an eye to explanatory rigor, sought to uncover causes and mechanisms, while later writers often framed events within moral or patriotic themes. Modern historiography has to sift through bias and rhetorical flourish to approach a balanced account. The Punic Wars illustrate how empires can be both resilient and fragile. Carthage demonstrated resilience in its recovery after each setback, repairing fleets, re-establishing trade, and finding new economic bases. Yet fragility revealed itself in the city's inability to fully integrate its empire into a political structure that could withstand Rome's systemic pressure. This tension between economic robustness and political fragility provides a deeper insight into why Carthage ultimately fell. The legacy of Carthage in later cultures is diverse. In Roman literature, it became a touchstone for cautionary tales about greed and wickedness, while in modern times its image has been reinterpreted by scholars who emphasize its role as a major Mediterranean power deserving of nuanced study. Carthage's memory has been used to support different political agendas across time, a testament to the enduring potency of its story. Mariners and merchants who sailed out of Carthaginian harbors contributed to the Mediterranean status as a connected economic space. Ships carried ideas as well as cargo, and the networks Carthage cultivated were conduits for cultural exchange across languages and religions. These maritime links made the Mediterranean a crucible of cross-cultural encounter where innovations in agriculture, navigation, and craft could travel quickly and transform distant communities. The study of the Punic Wars also reveals the limits of military success. Rome won battles and subjugated enemies, yet it had to grapple with the governance of diverse peoples and the social strains that imperial expansion produced. Managing newly annexed territories required administrative systems, the settling of veterans, and the accommodation of local elites, tasks that demanded institutional evolution even after the smoke of battle had cleared. Environmental and geographic factors shaped campaigns and outcomes in ways that are sometimes overlooked. The Mediterranean climate, seasonal winds, and topography influenced the timing of campaigns and the feasibility of resupply. Avalanches, storms, and disease could devastate armies as surely as enemy action, and commanders had to account for these uncontrollable variables in planning their strategies. The psychological warfare of reputation played a role in decisions on both sides. Hannibal's fearsome reputation created hesitancy and strategic recalibration in Rome, while Roman determination to appear implacable fed the intensity of demands made upon Carthage. Reputation affected alliances, recruitment, and the willingness of neutral powers to enter or avoid conflict, illustrating how perception can be as decisive as actual military strength. Looking at Carthage through numismatic evidence reveals insights into economic practice and political messaging. Coins bore images of gods, symbols of authority, and declarations of value that circulated across markets and made abstract power tangible. They served as portable statements about identity and reach, and the distribution of coinage provides clues about trade patterns, economic priorities, and the connections between distant parts of the Carthaginian world. The role of technology in siegecraft and defense evolved over the course of the wars. Engines for hurling stones, towers for scaling walls, and methods of undermining fortifications advanced as each side sought advantage. Carthage's urban defenses were formidable, but Rome's increasing mastery of siege techniques and its political will to undertake protracted sieges demonstrated that fortresses could be overcome with time, money, and determination. Civic life in Carthage blended local traditions with cosmopolitan tastes, producing arts and crafts that reflected Mediterranean syncretism. Pottery, metalwork, and religious iconography show contacts with Greece, Anatolia, and native African artistic currents. These forms of expression remind us that the city was not merely a martial competitor but also a cultural hub where ideas were exchanged and transformed. Carthage's diplomatic maneuvering in the years between wars provides a study in surviving under constraint. City leaders negotiated access to trade, petitioned for leniency, and attempted to reassert influence through soft power, using marriage alliances and commercial agreements. Such maneuvers reveal a nuanced political agency that sought to reclaim dignity under the shadow of a more powerful neighbor. The transitional period after Zama and before the Third Punic War saw Carthage attempting to navigate a new world order. It rebuilt its economy with care, avoided open military posturing, and engaged in regional commerce. Yet the structural changes imposed by defeat, loss of colonies, diminished military capacity, and Roman oversight created a diplomatic tightrope that was difficult to walk forever. The final destruction of Carthage evokes intense moral and philosophical questions about war, reprisal, and cultural eradication. Should a city be destroyed to preclude future danger, and what is lost when a center of learning, trade, and religion is erased? These queries reverberate through apologetic and polemics alike, and they press modern readers to weigh the ethical dimensions of ancient decisions without the simple certainties of ancient justifications. Carthage's military doctrine combined naval strength with a pragmatic use of hired forces and ally contingents. This hybridity allowed rapid response to local threats and provided specialty troops the city's own citizenry might lack. Yet the lack of a mobilizable citizen army comparable to Rome's legions inhibited Carthage in sustained continental campaigns, an organizational gap that had strategic consequences. The cultural interplay in Sicily before and during the wars demonstrates how contested spaces can become crucibles of exchange and conflict. Greeks, Phoenicians, Sicilians, and emerging powers like Rome all sought footholds on the island, and in striving for control they left traces of hybrid governance, rituals, and urban forms. Sicily thus functioned as a mirror in which the broader Mediterranean tensions were refracted and amplified. Rome's internal politics often influenced its foreign policy with Carthage. Generals returning from victories sought political office, senators leveraged triumphs for prestige, and debates over war and peace reshaped the city's priorities. Public opinion, influenced by speeches, spectacles, and the economic needs of citizens, could turn the tide toward aggression or conciliation, showing how domestic dynamics often dictated the tempo of imperial expansion. The role of individuals, Hamilcar, Hannibal, Scipio, Cato, Fabius, was dramatic but not absolute. While charismatic leaders shaped campaigns and inspired followings, structural factors like resource mobilization, alliances, and institutional resilience ultimately determined the outcome. Great men influenced events, but their achievements were woven into a broader fabric of social, economic, and political forces. One cannot tell the story of Carthage without acknowledging the voices of those who labored to keep the maritime economy afloat: dockworkers, sailors, artisans, and merchants whose daily toil underpinned grand strategies. Their work enabled fleets to sail, armies to be provisioned, and markets to thrive. The empire's power depended as much on these often anonymous people as it did on leaders and battles. In the aftermath of Carthage's fall, Rome faced the task of integrating former Carthaginian territories into an expanding state. Land redistribution, colonization, and the legal status of former inhabitants became contentious issues. How Rome managed these questions shaped the social landscape of the Western Mediterranean for generations and provided a model, sometimes brutal, sometimes pragmatic, for Roman provincial governance. The Punic Wars cast long shadows over subsequent Mediterranean politics and memory. Carthage's destruction removed a major competitor and opened space for Roman imperialism that would expand east and west. The wars thereby reshaped the pattern of Mediterranean power, setting Rome on a trajectory toward empire, and Carthage's fall became a symbol of the brutal logic of ancient geopolitics. Carthage's experience offers lessons about the limits of mercantile empires in the face of expansionist states. Wealth alone could not guarantee security when faced with an adversary willing to wage prolonged wars and mobilize populations for conquest. The tale underscores the importance of political cohesion, military adaptation, and the capacity to convert economic strength into sustainable strategic advantage. Historians today use a range of methods: textual analysis, archaeology, numismatics, and environmental studies to reconstruct the lives and conflicts of the Punic era. Cross-disciplinary approaches have deepened understanding of everything from dietary habits to shipbuilding techniques, enriching the narrative with detail that ancient sources could scarcely provide. These scholarly efforts reveal a past that is both knowable and complex, resisting the temptation to reduce it to simple morality plays. The imagery of Carthage in modern culture oscillates between ruin and romance. Artists and writers find in its story material for meditations on hubris, resilience, and the fragility of civilizations. The city's ruins and the legendary accounts of its fall continue to inspire creative retellings that make the ancient past feel immediate and emotionally resonant. Carthage's diplomatic agility before the wars shows how small states can leverage commerce and alliances to punch above their weight. By cultivating networks, negotiating treaties, and offering incentives to local leaders, Carthage built an informal empire that was efficient and commercially focused. Yet when faced with a state willing to impose structural integration through legal and military means, that approach had limits. The interaction between land and sea strategies across the Punic Wars demonstrates the interconnectedness of military domains. Control of ports affected supply lines, cavalry maneuvers in plains influenced naval resupply, and control of islands offered staging grounds for invasions. Commanders who grasped this interplay, who could bring land-based power to bear on naval issues and vice versa, had a decisive advantage. The Roman legal and political response to Carthaginian threats evolved over the course of the wars. Legislation governing military levies, veteran settlements, and provincial administration expanded Rome's capacity to wage sustained campaigns. These institutional changes underpinned Rome's success and illustrate how legal frameworks can be crucial instruments of imperial sustainability. Carthage's language and written records, though fragmentary, provide glimpses into a literate culture that engaged with law, commerce, and religion. Punic inscriptions, epitaphs, and administrative texts reveal a society that recorded transactions, honored ancestors, and articulated civic obligations. These fragments, while tantalizingly incomplete, help reconstruct a civic world that was literate, bureaucratically competent, and culturally rich. As you consider the arc of Carthage and Rome, it is important to recognize the dialectic of competition and exchange. The two powers were locked in a deadly rivalry, yet they also absorbed each other's practices, fought battles that tested the limits of contemporary technology, and shaped the Mediterranean into a world where ideas, goods, and people traversed boundaries with increasing frequency. The Punic Wars did not simply end a conflict, they redirected the currents of history. In the final analysis, Carthage stands as a testament to the complex dynamics of empire, a commercial marvel, a naval powerhouse, a polity with both pragmatic commerce and fierce ambition, and a culture that produced leaders whose deeds still reverberate. Its defeat illustrates the iron logic of imperial rivalry, where strategic depth, institutional resilience, and sheer persistence can determine the fate of nations. Yet its legacy endures in ruins, artifacts, and the stories we tell about courage, hubris, and the cost of dominance. The lessons of the Punic Wars remain relevant: control of trade routes, the integration of political and military structures, and the adaptability of institutions under pressure are timeless strategic considerations. Empires rise and fall, but the patterns of decision-making, the interplay of economics and force, and the human cost of conflict repeat across epochs. To listen to the story of Carthage is to listen to one chapter in a much larger human drama about power, survival, and memory. Walking through the archaeological remains and reading the scars left on the landscape offers an almost tactile connection to the past. You can imagine the sound of oars, the salt on traders' hands, and the cries of men at war. Such moments bridge centuries, reminding us that history is not merely a sequence of facts but a web of lived experiences. The ruins of Carthage, then, are more than stones, they are the preserved echo of a world that shaped the course of the Mediterranean forever. Carthage's story urges humility in the face of conquest. It reminds us that no polity, however wealthy or technically advanced, can assume permanence without political structures that secure loyalty and strategic depth. The Carthaginian example shows how commerce must be married to political coherence if a state is to survive existential challenges from rivals determined to impose their own order. Even in its ruin, Carthage taught Rome lessons about governance, infrastructure, and empire that would inform the Roman approach to provinces and trade. Roman imperial practice absorbed and adapted ideas from conquered peoples. In doing so, it built a more complex and administratively rich empire. The act of conquest, therefore, also became an act of cultural appropriation and institutional borrowing. Centuries after the smoke of war cleared, historians and listeners alike are still drawn to the dramatic sweep of the Punic Wars because they tell us about human ambition writ large. They reveal how individual choices intersect with structural forces and how the tides of history can be turned by calculation, chance, and courage. The conflict between Carthage and Rome is not merely ancient history, it is a mirror in which modern readers can examine the dynamics of rivalry and the expensive price of supremacy. There is a final human note to the story. The people who survived the wars carried memories and traditions into new political arrangements. Their descendants lived under Roman rule, adapted local practices to imperial norms, and kept alive fragments of Punic language and ritual in ways that only archaeology and epigraphy can now trace. In that sense, Carthage never vanished entirely. It was transformed and incorporated into an evolving Mediterranean civilization. The wars for the Mediterranean between Carthage and Rome are thus both a dramatic saga of battles and a slow-motion story of cultural and political transformation. They show how rivalry catalyzes innovation, how defeat can lead to reinvention, and how societies remember or rewrite their pasts in the service of new identities. Listening closely, we can hear not only swords clashing and oars rowing, but also the quieter rhythms of trade, prayer, and daily life that sustained a city for centuries. If you drive away from these tales with a single sense of what makes them endure, let it be this: the clash between Carthage and Rome was about more than territory. It was about different visions of what Mediterranean life should be, an ocean of trading hubs bound by commerce and negotiation, or a connected empire ordered by imperial power. The wars resolved that question in favor of Rome, but the traces of Carthage's alternative vision survived in trade practices, cultural forms, and the collective memory of the ancient world. In the end, Carthage remains a cautionary and fascinating story, a maritime empire that rose on commerce, mastered the sea, and ultimately met a fate that transformed the Mediterranean world. The ruins, artifacts, and histories we examine today are the debris of a great contest, and they invite us to consider how power is won, maintained, and lost. The city that Rome tried to erase still speaks across the centuries, and its voice challenges us to listen with care. When you first hear the name Hannibal, it arrives with weight and a certain thunder. It is not just a man we speak of, but a movement of ambition and fury, of a small city defying the might of an empire. To understand what he achieved, you must imagine the Mediterranean world as a chessboard where Rome believes it controls every square. Hannibal moves like a player who has studied the board for years and learned patterns Romans refused to see. Carthage was older than Rome in many ways, a city shaped by sea and trade, by negotiation and the blunt force of market necessity. It sat on a peninsula, varnished by salt and commerce, and its citizens learned to balance cunning with wealth. They had colonies and influence across the western Mediterranean and a memory of conflict with Greeks and Iberians. When Rome and Carthage collided, it was not the story of two equals but of two different orders of power rubbing against each other until sparks became flames. Hannibal was born into that world of salt and deal-making, yet his childhood was bound to a pulse of bitter hatred for Rome. His father, Hamilcar Barca, carried a personal vendetta and taught his son to see Rome not as an abstract rival but as a mortal enemy. Legend says a young Hannibal swore upon his father's sword to never be a friend of Rome, and that oath shaped every march and every sleepless night of planning. It is the private fury behind public genius, the human fuel that turns strategy into obsession. The decision to strike Rome through the Alps was as much about psychology as it was about geography. Carthage could have struck along the coast, it could have used its fleet and islands, but Hannibal chose the route Rome thought impossible. By doing so, he transformed an army's movement into a message: you cannot trust the borders you thought secure. The Alps were not merely a mountain pass, they were a stage on which Hannibal would enact an argument against Roman supremacy. To imagine Hannibal's march, picture not a single moment of daring but a long series of gambles. His army was a mosaic of peoples, languages, and loyalties, from Libyan citizens to Spanish mercenaries, and from Gallic warriors to the elephants that loomed like living engines of myth. Managing those different strands required more than orders, it required a deep understanding of human nature. He had to bind them into a single will, and so he carried not only banners and provisions but promises and a reputation that would sway hearts. Logistics shaped the campaign at every step, and Hannibal's genius is visible in how he refused to be outmaneuvered by supply lines. In a world before railways or quick resupply, armies lived off the land or failed. Hannibal taught his troops to live with scarcity, to strike swiftly to seize what they needed, and to keep morale high despite deprivation. Where Rome expected starvation and surrender in the mountains, they found Hannibal finding forges, routes, and courage. Crossing the Ebro River and moving through Iberia was a prelude that proved his leadership. Hannibal fought and won, not simply by the edge of the sword but through alliances and cunning negotiations. The Iberians added numbers and local knowledge, and Carthaginian officers learned how to forge loyalty from diversity. Each victory there was a rehearsal for the greater theater ahead, smoothing the path into the unknown. The crossing of the Rhone has been romanticized, but its reality was pragmatic and complex. Hannibal could not rely on local friendliness to simply hand him passage, so he orchestrated a combination of diversion and speed. He faced Gaulish tribes that were sometimes hostile and sometimes opportunistic, and he moved like a man threading a needle while keeping both eyes open. The purpose was to get to the Alps while keeping the enemy guessing. Then came the Alps, and here the narrative meets human fragility and sublime imagination. The mountains are often called the wall in histories, and for good reason. They are sharp, narrow, and indifferent. Hannibal took men who had never known such altitudes and guided them across passes of ice and wind. Elephants, mythic to those who would later tell the story, had to be coaxed, guarded, and fed. They were symbols and tools and liabilities in a landscape that would not yield. Every step upwards required improvisation. Hannibal used scouts and negotiated with tribes when possible, but sometimes he had to force his way through rocks and narrow passes. He burned bridges when necessary to prevent pursuit and used the terrain to his advantage when defending. The mountain roads were a test of discipline, and Hannibal proved able to hold his diverse army together when many commanders would have broken. Losses in the Alps were inevitable, but the march was not a catastrophe as some later Roman propagandists would say. He arrived into northern Italy with a diminished force, but with an army that had something far more valuable than numbers: experience. Those who survived had been hardened by cold and hardship. They were ready for battle in a land where confidence could topple kings. Hannibal's arrival in Italy was a shock because it showed that Rome's inner territories could be penetrated. The first serious battles in Italy reveal Hannibal's tactical mind at work, turning local unrest into strategic advantage. Roman armies were punctual and trained to fight in formations and set plays. Hannibal preferred maneuver, deception, and flexibility, and he exploited the Roman habit of conventionality. At the Trebia River, in the haze of winter, he baited and encircled, using terrain and ambush to deliver a crushing blow. After Trebia, Hannibal's reputation began to grow not just among his enemies but among allies who saw possibility. The Battle of Lake Trasimene would amplify his image, because there he turned an entire lake shore into a trap. Roman commanders were lured into a constricted space of fog and hillside and found themselves facing slaughter from invisible positions. The memory of that day fed Roman fear and Carthaginian confidence, and it pushed neutral tribes to reconsider which side might favor their future. Kenny stands as Hannibal's masterpiece, often studied in military academies, but to reduce it to abstract study is to lose its human dimensions. Their Rome gathered strength and arrogance alike, and Hannibal countered with patience and a sense of timing. He allowed the center to fold like a concave palm, pulling in Roman force before his flanks closed the circle. When the trap snapped, the slaughter was more than a tactical victory, it was proof that Rome's style could be broken. Yet Hannibal's success at Cannae also showed the limits of battlefield triumph. He could win again and again in the field, but winning hearts in Italy and turning those wins into a political victory proved much harder. Cities were cautious. Rome, shamed though it was, refused to capitulate and began to adapt. The Roman Senate changed generals and tactics, and slowly it learned to avoid the encounters that Hannibal preferred. Victory on the plain did not automatically become victory in the War of States. Hannibal's famous maneuvering shows a mind-seeking leverage at every scale. He was as much a diplomat as a general, attempting to win over allies among the Italian states and to break Rome's confederation. He offered freedom and protection in words that carried weight because of his victories, but trust is slow to be won. Many Italian cities feared the might of Rome more than they trusted the promise of an outsider, and that hesitation cost Hannibal opportunities he could not force. Meanwhile, Rome was not idle. The city learned to fight a different war, avoiding pitched battles and targeting Carthaginian holdings and reinforcements. Roman strategy shifted to containment and attrition, tying down Hannibal's forces with time. While Hannibal created a fearsome reputation on Italian soil, Rome's resilience grew from its capacity to suffer and reorganize. The conflict transformed from a war of episodes into a grinding test of endurance. Across the Mediterranean, the geopolitical chessboard changed. Carthage sent reinforcements and resources, but internal politics and rivalries made a coherent long-term support network difficult. The Punic power structure was not monolithic, and Hannibal often had to fight not only Romans but the inertia of his own homeland. Financial constraints, competition among nobles, and the distant worry of home made Hannibal's enterprise a wonder of personal initiative rather than a guaranteed projection of state power. Hannibal's supply lines were a constant concern. He could win battles, but he could not easily replace lost men when his homeland hesitated. The elephants became symbols of the story because they were visible and mesmerizing, yet they could not replace trained infantry and cavalry. Hannibal sought allies in the Greek cities of southern Italy and appealed to tribes, but Rome's diplomatic resilience meant that most cities hedged their bets. The war became a test of political imagination as much as military prowess. As the years dragged on, and Roman resources were marshaled anew, the theater moved. Roman strategy turned toward Carthage's periphery, harrying its holdings and seeking to open a new front. The war expanded beyond the familiar battlegrounds into North Africa, and this shift forced Hannibal to consider defending the homeland. His genius, which had flourished in Italy, now faced the complication of shifting theaters and the necessity of responding to political shifts far from his command post. Scipio Africanus emerged as the Roman commander who could match Hannibal in innovation and in daring. He studied Hannibal like a scholar reading a rival's script and began to mimic the flexibility and boldness that had served Carthage well. Where Roman command had once emphasized method and tradition, Scipio brought improvisation to Rome's game. The two commanders, though enemies, were drawn into a duel that would decide the fate of their peoples. The climactic confrontation in Africa was not merely a replay of earlier battles, it was the meeting of two strategic minds whose context had shifted. Hannibal left Italy to defend Carthage when the danger to his city became existential, and he found in Scipio a general who understood how to draw him out. At Zama, The contest became a lesson in adjustment and nerve. Hannibal's elephants, once a tool of psychological dominion, were met by Roman preparations that blunted their shock. Tactics at Zama were complex and artful. Both sides arranged their forces with care, but it was Scipio's ability to handle the elephants and to disrupt Carthaginian cohesion that turned the tide. Hannibal fought with the same spirit of audacity that had carried him across the Alps, but the context had changed and Rome's learning had matured. The defeat was decisive. It did not merely take a battle, it reshaped Carthage's future. The peace that followed was harsh and transformative. Carthage lost territory, power, and the capacity to resist Rome in any substantive way. The city that had once sailed with confidence was forced into a new role as a subordinate trading partner, constrained by treaties that strangled its military potential. Hannibal himself survived, though the life of a great general was no longer the same after such a capitulation. He would live on, an embodied memory of defiance, but the Carthage that dreamed of empire would never return to its former radiance. Hannibal's later life carried shades of tragedy. He remained restless and unwilling to accept a purely private life of exile. He offered his experience to other courts and continued to battle in diplomatic arenas, trying to secure a future for his city through influence rather than arms. The Romans pursued him not only as an enemy of the past, but as a symbol that might yet inspire new resistance. He moved from court to court like a wound that refuses to heal. In the final chapters, Hannibal chose to die rather than be paraded in Rome. He drank poison, according to the poet's account, and with that act he preserved his dignity and denied Rome the spectacle of triumph over him. The gesture was in keeping with a life lived at the extreme of principle and pride. His death became part of the narrative he had written with his campaigns, a man who would not be captured by fate's ordinary hands. What does Hannibal's story tell us beyond the romance of daring? It teaches about the limits and power of leadership. He proved that a single mind, when married to conviction and craft, can alter the calculations of far larger states. But it also shows the limits of individual genius in the face of structural resilience. Rome was adaptable, patient, and wealthy in ways Carthage was not, and that asymmetry mattered ultimately more than any single campaign. The sources that tell Hannibal's story are themselves part of the drama. Roman historians wrote much of what we now accept as truth, and they had reasons to both fear and leonize him. Their words are crosshatched with bias, admiration, and the need to explain defeat. Modern historians wrestle with these texts, trying to separate what might be propaganda from what might be plain fact, and the result is a richer, more ambiguous portrait than any simple heroic tale. Legends grew around Hannibal quickly. He became a symbol in both admiration and fear, sometimes painted as the perfect military commander, sometimes as the man who could not convert tactical genius into political victory. The elephant crossing the Alps turned into an image that art and literature could not resist, and artists found in that crossing a metaphor for daring itself. With time, the line between myth and memory blurred, and Hannibal became a figure larger than the sum of recorded events. The fall of Carthage, years after Hannibal's campaign, shows how memory can be weaponized. Rome, having learned to fear and then to outlast Carthage, would finally move to erase it completely in the Third Punic War. The city was razed and its lands confiscated, and the world that had produced Hannibal was physically remade by Roman hands. This destruction was not merely strategic, it was symbolic, a final judgment intended to prevent history from repeating itself. Even as Carthage fell, Hannibal's legacy survived in surprising ways. Military thinkers studied his maneuvers, and later commanders borrowed from his playbook. He became a cautionary tale and a manual of tactics, and his life fed the imagination of leaders who wanted both caution and inspiration. In modern memory, Hannibal is at once an example of brilliant audacity and a reminder that greatness requires an environment that sustains it. Consider further how Hannibal has been used in political rhetoric across centuries. Leaders have invoked him to suggest audacity and strategic thinking, while others have used his story to warn about the dangers of overreach. Because his story is picturesque, it fits many narratives: the hero, the tragic figure, the exotic enemy who dared to confront a civic giant. The malleability of his image tells us as much about later storytellers as it does about Hannibal himself. There is also a human tale in the loyalty and suffering of Hannibal's soldiers. These were men who trusted a foreign general to lead them into the greatest unknowns. They ate hardships, saw comrades fall, and followed commands they might not have understood. Their endurance reminds us that history's great acts require ordinary people who take extraordinary risks. The march is as much their story as it is Hannibal's. Hannibal's strategic mind gave equal weight to surprise and the exploitation of expectation. He understood that a humiliated army could be more dangerous than a defeated one, and that the psychological blow of an unexpected maneuver could reverberate more effectively than a dozen smaller victories. He made his moves in ways designed to unsettle, to break the rhythm of Roman response, and to induce panic. It was a kind of warfare that sought victory not by attrition alone but by the collapse of will. Yet there were moments where his audacity collided with pragmatism in ways that constrained him. Attempts to win over southern Italian cities produced fits and starts. Hannibal faced the problem of proportionality, how to translate battlefield dominance into political restructuring. Freeing a city from Roman control was simple enough in a tactical sense, but creating a new network of alliances that could sustain itself long-term proved complex and elusive. These frictions shaped the arc of the war. Hannibal's tactics at Cannae included a remarkable use of cavalry and flanking moves that capitalized on Roman overconfidence. He used the terrain to shape the battlefield and tricked Roman commanders into committing their best troops in the wrong place. The massacre that followed was devastating, and it carved a reputation into the stone of memory that would be felt for generations. But the victory also drew Hannibal into a strategy that expected Rome to break politically, an expectation Rome refused to meet. The Roman adaptation after Cannae is a study in resilience rather than folly. Rather than crumble, Rome reorganized, refined her legions, and shifted to a strategy that avoided the traps Hannibal excelled at setting. The Fabian strategy, named for a Roman leader who advocated delay and harassment rather than direct confrontation, embodied a new awareness of Hannibal's strengths. Rome accepted suffering in the short term to preserve its core, a choice that ultimately ran counter to the single-minded brilliance that Hannibal exhibited. Hannibal's personality emerges through the accounts as stern, charismatic, and disciplined. He could be ruthless when required, but he was not mindlessly violent. He treated allies with a mixture of firmness and generosity, knowing that the bonds of loyalty could be cemented by both reward and respect. His soldiers loved and feared him in ways that are common to leaders who carry a people's fate on their shoulders. The logistical feats required to move an army and elephants across the Alps remain astonishing when you consider the technology of the time. Roads were mere tracks, food preservation was rudimentary, and weather was an unforgiving variable. Hannibal's planners had to account for forage, shelter, and the tempo of human tolerance. Each decision to delay or push forward risked frostbite, starvation, or collapse, and yet those decisions were made with a clarity that suggests experience and cold calculation. We should also consider the cultural implications of Hannibal's campaign for Italy itself. His presence exposed divisions within the Roman alliance and forced a political reevaluation among subject cities. Some groups seized the moment to press for autonomy, while others tightened their loyalty to Rome out of fear. The social fabric of the peninsula was stretched and rewoven, and in the process it revealed which bonds were brittle and which could hold fast. In the centuries that followed, Hannibal became more than a historical figure. He became a symbol in literature and art, a dramatic figure for poets and painters. He inspired novels, paintings, and even operas that recast his life through the lens of romance and tragedy. Artists found in his crossing of the Alps an image of extreme woe and suffering that could stand for many human struggles. Art thus helped to keep his memory alive in ways that official history sometimes did not. Modern scholarship has tried to peel away the layers of legend to find a plausible Hannibal, and in doing so it has embraced nuance. Historians have debated about numbers, tactics, and the veracity of ancient sources, but they have also highlighted his adaptability and his ability to operate within complex political constraints. The result is a Hannibal who is both a tactical genius and a man constrained by circumstance, a figure whose grandeur is made more poignant by realistic limits. There are also lessons here for modern strategy beyond the battlefield. Hannibal teaches the value of surprise, the importance of logistics, and the centrality of political vision in wartime. But he also warns against neglecting the wider political context. Tactical brilliance must be matched by strategic follow-through if any long-term objectives are to be realized. The lesson is timeless. A plan must be complete, not merely brilliant in parts. The Roman reaction to Hannibal is instructive about how societies learn from existential threats. Rome's institutions, its capacity to conscript manpower, and its fiscal resilience allowed it to absorb defeats and learn. The Senate's ability to marshal resources and to change leaders without fundamental collapse was decisive. Hannibal could not topple a system that was fundamentally resilient, which suggests that a single campaign, however remarkable, confronts broader structures that can adapt. In Carthage, the political aftershocks of the war created a dividing line between those who wanted to appease Rome and those who wanted to challenge it. That cleavage undermined unified action. Hannibal, who had been a commander and not a politician in the traditional sense, found himself fighting internal battles as much as external ones. Power is as much negotiated within as it is fought for without, and Carthage's inability to produce a stable home front impaired her external defense. Hannibal's long shadow affects how the modern world views both Carthage and Rome. Carthage is often cast as the tragic city that dared greatly, while Rome is seen as the slow, steady hegemon. The dichotomy is tempting because it simplifies morality into narrative arcs, but reality remains complex. Both civilizations were capable of high art and wanton cruelty, of shrewd diplomacy and clumsy mistakes. The interplay between them is a mirror for how empires interact even today. Consider the technology of warfare in Hannibal's time, which shaped possibilities and limits. Spears, swords, and cavalry were the tools of battle, and elephants were extraordinary additions rather than game-changing singularities. Siegecraft, logistics, and naval power all played roles that are easy to minimize when focusing on battlefield brilliance. Hannibal worked within this technological framework, and his creativity often emerged in maximizing what he had rather than longing for what he did not. Hannibal's own character elements, his charisma and his rigorous discipline, offer a portrait of leadership that remains instructive. He believed in the morale of his men and in leading by example. He rode with them in the cold, accepted hardship, and did not shield himself from the consequences of his orders. That kind of personal example binds troops to a commander in ways that regulations cannot, and it was key to his successes in the field. The psychological side of warfare under Hannibal included the manipulation of fear and expectation. He understood that a sudden defeat could do more damage to an opponent's cohesion than many small victories. He orchestrated moments where Roman oversight and pride were used against them, creating opportunities that leveraged emotion as much as movement. That was his art, to shape not only the battlefield but the mind that approached it. There were also moral complexities to Hannibal's campaigns. War in antiquity was brutal, and civilians often bore the brunt of violence. Hannibal's army sometimes attacked and plundered in ways that would horrify modern sensibilities, yet the same could be said of his Roman opponents. The moral landscape of the time permitted actions we now judge harshly, and to understand Hannibal fully is to accept the uncomfortable reality of his era's norms. The aftermath of his African defeat also set the stage for Rome's transformation from a regional hegemon into a Mediterranean superpower. The elimination of Carthage as a rival opened opportunities for Roman expansion, and the political vacuum reshaped trade networks and alliances. Hannibal's resistance delayed rather than prevented that outcome, and in the process he became the great counterfactual of history. What might have happened had Rome broken after Zama? Hannibal's life also invites questions about identity and belonging. He was a Carthaginian of mixed cultural influences, operating in a polyglot world. His troops came from different regions and spoke different languages, yet he forged them into a unit capable of extraordinary performance. He embodied the hybrid nature of ancient Mediterranean identity, where trade and war mixed and where loyalties were layered and contingent. The telling of Hannibal's story over millennia tells us as much about later ages as it does about him. Renaissance commanders admired his audacity, Enlightenment thinkers praised his rational planning, and modern strategists debated his tactics. Each age projects its own values onto him, making Hannibal a kind of historical mirror. He survives because his life contains themes that are eternally compelling: courage, ingenuity, and the tragic limits of human ambition. In the end, Hannibal's genius was a combination of intuition, experience, and the stubborn willingness to act against the probable. He often chose the improbable path because he calculated that probability alone favored the enemy's complacency. Whether or not he could have ever toppled Rome permanently is a subject of debate, but his capacity to unsettle and to force change is undeniable. He reshaped a period of history by sheer force of will and intellect. We can still learn from the subtler aspects of his leadership, such as his attention to detail, his cultivation of loyalty, and his deft handling of alliance politics. He understood that a great general is not merely a tactician of the field but a manager of men and foes. He took into account the psychology of enemy commanders and the needs of his own soldiers, balancing force with finesse in ways that modern leaders still study. Hannibal's legacy echoes in modern conceptions of asymmetric warfare, where a smaller, more adaptable force can challenge a larger power by choosing the time and place of engagement. His campaign is a historical lesson in selecting the terms of battle and in making risk work for you. Yet the lesson also cautions against confusing tactical surprise with strategic victory. The map of power is drawn by resources, institutions, and time as much as by the brilliance of any commander. The story of Carthage itself deserves contemplation alongside Hannibal's deeds. Carthage was a civilization with maritime skill and commercial insight, and its destruction robbed the Mediterranean of an alternate model of Mediterranean governance. The rise of Rome filled that void, leading to centuries of Roman dominance that shaped law, language, and culture across Europe and North Africa. Hannibal stands at the hinge of that transformation, a figure whose personal courage could not ultimately prevent a sweeping historical reconfiguration. As you reflect on Hannibal marching toward Rome, remember that history is rarely clean in its moral judgments. This was a man who violated no small number of modern taboos, yet he also exhibited qualities we admire: bravery, intellect, loyalty. His life asks us to hold complexity without simplifying tragedy into myth. In doing so, we honor the truth that great deeds often live in the gray between the heroic and the fraught. The archaeological record and the written sources together form a tapestry where threads are frayed and colors shift with each new discovery. Scholars continue to debate routes, casualty numbers, and chronology, and each new find reframes old assumptions. That ongoing conversation keeps Hannibal alive not as a fossilized icon but as a living subject of inquiry. The march across the Alps is as vivid now as ever because it remains open to interpretation and wonder. Hannibal's story also invites us to think about how leaders manage fear, both in themselves and in others. He mastered the use of dread as a weapon while also needing to assure his own men that terror could be overcome. He balanced intimidation with reassurance, and he recognized that morale is a fragile commodity bought with deeds and promises. That understanding of emotion in war is part of what made him exceptional. Finally, the image of Hannibal should not overshadow the broader human cost of these centuries of warfare. Cities burned, families were displaced, and economies were strained by years of struggle. Great commanders create narratives that can obscure this human toll, and so remembering the cost is part of a balanced memory. Hannibal's genius did not erase suffering, and that sobering truth is part of the full story we must carry forward. When you imagine Hannibal today, let your mind move beyond the postcard of an elephant on a mountain pass. See instead a prolonged test of intelligence against institutions, of daring against endurance, and of human will against structural power. See a leader who stretched the possibilities of his age and whose actions forced Rome to become something new. His march remains an act of human audacity, inscribed not only in history books but in the way we think about strategy, loyalty, and the price of ambition. In the quiet spaces where history lingers, Hannibal's memory resonates because it is messy and compelling. He was not merely a villain or a hero, he was a figure whose life challenged the assumptions of empire and changed the course of nations. To listen to his story is to listen to the clash between two visions of power, and to witness how one man's will can leave a mark that centuries cannot erase. That is why his name continues to carry the thunder with which we began. The story begins with a city of salt sea breezes and stone, a harbor that turned east and west like a pair of hands ready to bargain with the world. Carthage grew from a handful of traders into an empire of merchants and mariners, its ships streaking the Mediterranean with sails like bright flags and its markets full of fabrics, metals, and an ease with risk that made rivals uneasy. Its people were rooted in ancestral Phoenician culture but drew on African fields and island ports, turning the commerce of the sea into something like power. This slow accumulation of wealth and influence would be admired by some and feared by others until fear hardened into something worse, the determination to erase a rival from the map. The first sharp blows that set Rome and Carthage on a collision course came in stages, years folding into decades until a contest of empires became inevitable. Two great wars had already carved patterns in Roman memory, one leaving scars and grudges and the other producing legends of Hannibal crossing the Alps with elephants and Roman resilience tested to its core. Rome learned to hate the idea of a Mediterranean rival that could threaten its grain routes, its alliances, or its honor. Between the bruises of past conflict and the petty intrigues of statesmen, a narrative of existential threat took shape in Roman political life. After Hannibal and the long years of the Second War, Carthage limped but endured, turning inward to rebuild commerce and local authority while carefully avoiding any overt military revival. Rome, however, refused to trust those outward signs of peace, interpreting recovery as a masked menace. The treaty that had ended hostilities required Carthage to submit to humiliations that would not be easily forgotten, and each rumor of recovery or economic reinvigoration sparked calls in Rome that the former enemy must be watched or punished. What began as surveillance turned into a demand: dismantle, cede, or die quietly. Carthage resisted with stubborn civic pride and human desperation. Between the larger currents of imperial rivalry flowed smaller, interpersonal ambitions. Roman statesmen saw advantage in a decisive campaign, either to end a strategic threat or to make names for themselves in history. There was a rhythm to Roman politics that rewarded boldness, and generals found public opinion eager for dramatic closure. On the other side, Carthaginian leaders had to weigh survival against honor, making choices under unbearable pressure that would determine whether their city would stand, negotiate, or be swept away. Into this charged landscape stepped Massinissa, the Numidian king whose shifting alliances and opportunism squeezed the Carthaginians constantly along their borders. His raids eroded farmland and morale. His claims on territory became a jagged saw tearing at the city's ability to feed itself. Carthage appealed to Rome against his encroachments, but Rome found ways to benefit from Numidian strength and used legalistic arguments to restrain Carthage. The result was a slow strangulation, trade corridors choked, fields ravaged, and the palace of policy in Carthage forced to choose between submission and resistance. The immediate flashpoint that propelled Rome into the final conflict was a petty but explosive affair: Carthage's decision to resist a local Numidian incursion without direct Roman approval. Rome declared this a breach of treaty, and what began as diplomatic harassment hardened into the demand for Carthage to abandon its city and move inland. To a people whose identity was bound to harbor in stone, such a command was sacrilege, and refusal lit the fuse on an inevitable, brutal confrontation. What followed was not merely a war of armies, but a war to rewrite the memory of a people. When Roman legions finally arrived to lay siege, the air itself seemed charged in new ways, as if the Mediterranean sky had leaned in to watch. The Roman commander was a scion of a great family, known to history as Scipio Aemilianus, who had come with the mandate to end the Carthaginian problem once and for all. He was a man both admired and feared, shaped by Roman education in ruthlessness and restraint. He brought not only soldiers and siege engines, but the full force of Rome's determination to make an example. The siege of Carthage was not a single, smooth operation, but a sequence of grinds and breakthroughs, months of engineering and attrition that tested the city's resilience to the bone. Roman ships clamped the harbor, Roman walls pressed against Carthage's fortifications, and every day brought the thud of battering rams and the hiss of missiles. Inside the city, people reorganized their lives around survival, streets converted to defensive blow, homes fortified into small citadels, and marketplaces turned into staging grounds for last-ditch sorties. The psychological weight was immense. Fear and resolve intermixed in households as families debated whether to stockpile grain, flee, or join the fight. Carthage had built walls to impress and to deter, massive ramparts that had stood for generations and seemed almost to embody the city's pride. But even the oldest stones are not eternal when faced with repeated, concentrated assault, and Roman engineers found ways to exploit weakness, undermining walls and launching assaults where they saw thinness. The fight to reach the core of the city was measured not just in meters but in moments of human calamity: a breach, a firefight, a mad dash through narrow alleys, and always the shadow of burning that could begin at any instant. Each small victory for Rome tightened the ring and made the final unraveling more certain. Within Carthage, leadership shifted with the urgency of the moment. Citizens and generals who might once have argued about trade policy now debated whether to burn bridges or surrender, whether to evacuate women and children by sea or to keep them within the last bastions of stone. Hope flickered in the ways of the resourceful, scuttled boats repurposed as floating barricades, secret stores of grain brought into hidden courtyards, and desperate sallies launched against Roman works to buy time. The human cost of these choices was staggering. Stores of courage were exhausted even as enemies multiplied. One of the most vivid images from the final days was of urban combat so close that neighbors could not be certain if the noises in the night were coming from Roman soldiers or from their own defenders. Streets narrowed into trenches, doorways turned into loopholes for muskets and missiles. Children learned the taste of fear too early. Men and women took up arms, terrified citizens became irregular fighters, and the city took on a new texture: scorched, chaotic, warning yet defiant. The Roman troops, drilled and disciplined, pushed forward with a grim determination shaped by years of practice in breaking city resistance. The moment of breach brought an unstoppable force into the heart of Carthage, and with it the rituals of war that were both practical and symbolic. Buildings caught fire, temples and houses burned not always by design but by the loose hand of combat. According to some ancient writers, fires licked the city for days, and the skyline was a blackened silhouette against a red dusk. It is important to remember that such accounts were often shaped by rhetoric, but the archaeological record confirms layers of ash and collapsed masonry that attest to sweeping conflagration. Carthage fought on hill by hill and street by street, the Bursa Hill a last theater of stubborn defense where the city's last organized resistance concentrated. Romans closed in like a tide, and defenders scrambled to plug breaches, set traps, and hurl missiles down upon the enemy. When the Roman standard finally crested the Bursa and the citizen defenders saw themselves surrounded, the emotional toll must have been unbearable, pride stripped of options, the need to choose what lives to save amid a disaster that compounded with every hour. The city that had once commanded coastal routes now found every route to safety cut off. What happened to the people of Carthage at the end of the fighting is one of the most haunting chapters of this story. Many were killed in the final fighting, others were taken captive, handed over to a future of slavery that would send them across the Roman world as labor and spectacle. Contemporary accounts vary widely about numbers and conditions, but the human outcome was devastating: families broken, traditions suspended, and a community scattered. Those who survived carried a memory of loss that became a kind of living exile. Among the most enduring images is the story that Romans sowed the ruins with salt so that nothing would ever grow there again. It is an image so powerful that it became shorthand for total destruction in later centuries. Modern scholarship, however, treats this as more legend than fact, a rhetorical flourish that underscores Roman thoroughness but that lacks strong contemporary evidence. Archaeologists have not found a blanket of salt in the ruined layers, and historians suggest the story grew into existence as a metaphor for annihilation rather than as literal policy. Even without salted earth, the physical destruction was thorough. Houses and public buildings collapsed into piles of stone, bricks, and scorched timber, and the carefully engineered harbors were rendered useless by debris and blockade. Ships that once moved goods day and night lay beached or broken, and the intricate networks of commerce that had kept the city breathing were severed. What remained was more than rubble. It was a topography of absence, a city whose daily hum had been replaced by silence and the occasional sound of looters or scavengers. Rome did not simply destroy, it also incorporated the story of destruction into its political narrative. Victorious leaders celebrated triumphs in dramatic festivals, parading spoils and captives through the streets of Rome as proof that the Republic had survived and dominated. Such public displays hardened the Roman self-image as the bringer of order, but they also used Carthage's end as a lesson in what happens to those who threaten Rome. That narrative served political purposes at home as much as strategic ones abroad. For Romans who looked at Carthage afterward, the city could be framed as both a cautionary tale and a territorial prize. Edward Gibbon and other later historians would dramatize Rome's actions as the culmination of imperial destiny, while some modern scholars see a mixture of fear, envy, and pragmatic security calculations behind Roman choices. The destruction fed into a Roman identity that celebrated finality. Enemies were not always merely defeated, they were sometimes obliterated to prevent resurgence. The memory of Carthage thus became a foundational myth for a state that sought permanence. But Carthage did not entirely vanish from memory or from the map of influence. Centuries later, Rome would allow or even encourage the growth of a new city in roughly the same area, one tied into its own economy and governance rather than a rival network of maritime commerce. The Roman reconstruction repurposed the landscape, building new streets and public works that signaled both continuity and transformation. Even as Rome stamped its name on the place, fragments of Carthaginian life persisted beneath new layers, like fingerprints under a new coat of paint. Archaeology has been a patient revealer of these layers, peeling back centuries of use to show the coexistence of cultures and the complex palimpsest of human habitation. Excavations have turned up pottery, inscriptions, and structural outlines that are part Phoenician, part Roman, and part something in between. These finds complicate the simple story of erasure, showing that even when political identity is crushed, cultural traces persist and resurface. Soil preserves more than soil, it preserves stories that cannot be entirely burned away. The ritual and religious life of Carthage, a subject still fraught with debate, adds another dimension to understanding the city's end. Ancient writers accused Carthaginians of rites that shocked Roman sensibilities, and later interpretations turned those accusations into moral justification for harsh treatment. Modern scholars urge caution. Evidence like the Tofut, a cemetery of urns and stelae, can be interpreted as both a burial ground for infants and as the residue of ritual sacrifice, and the truth may be complex. Whatever the past practices, the Romans used moral language about religion as one of many rationales for destruction, mixing political motive with moral condemnation. The politics of memory in Rome turned the ruins into a lesson book. Orators and senators used the fall of Carthage to dramatize arguments about foreign policy and internal morals, to argue for toughness or to warn against laxity. Children growing up in Rome learned the story as a kind of civic catechism. Enemies could be destroyed, but Rome would remain. Such lessons, repeated in public speech and writing, created an emotional landscape in which literal destruction became an emblem of political resolve. Outside the capitals and the courts, artists and poets picked over the pieces for inspiration. The city of Dido at the beginning of Virgil's Aeneid resonates with the later memory of Carthage, a fusion of tragic love and political destiny that foreshadows grief and ruin. Artists in marble and painters in fresco would return to images of fallen walls and ruined columns, each rendering a human reaction to the spectacle of collapse. Over time, the fall of Carthage became a story told not only as history but also as a moral drama about the costs of empire and the consequences of rivalry. Across the centuries, Carthage has taken on different symbolic forms depending on who is telling the tale: a cautionary fable for conquerors, a martyr for anti-imperialists, a symbol of lost civilization for melancholic historians. In colonial and post-colonial narratives, the fall has been invoked to discuss modern domination and resistance, sometimes reimagined to speak to contemporary struggles. That elasticity of meaning shows how historical events can be refashioned to serve new ethical and political arguments long after the original actors are gone. Modern Tunisia carries the archaeological and cultural legacy of Carthage as an integral thread in its national identity and its tourism economy. The ruins are a place of pilgrimage for people curious about antiquity and for those who want to touch a site layered with deep significance. Museums display artifacts recovered from the sands, while the landscape itself, Bursa Hill, ruined ports, mosaic floors, speaks to a continuity of place even when sovereignty changed. The site is thus both a relic of imperial struggle and a living part of national memory that Tunisians integrate into narratives of resilience. Scholars continue to debate the motives behind Rome's final decision to raise Carthage, refining arguments with the careful sifting of sources and the slow accumulation of evidence. Some emphasize strategic rationales, a fear of naval revival, a desire to secure North African grain imports, and a need to neutralize a power that might realign with other Mediterranean states. Others point to the psychological urge to complete what had been started decades earlier, to erase the humiliation of earlier Roman defeats and craft a clean historical arc of victory. Most agree that motive was rarely singular. It was a weave of military calculation, economic self-interest, political theater, and cultural resentment. The study of this event is also a study in how ancient sources shape modern understanding. Polybius, a Greek historian who wrote with an eye for causality, offers a pragmatic view of Roman motives and military maneuvers. Appian provides vivid, dramatic accounts that emphasize moral lessons and the theatrical elements of destruction. Livy, whose fuller accounts of Rome were filtered through lost books and later summaries, contributed rhetoric and patriotic moralizing that subsequent readers would magnify. Each voice is a lens, and the historian's job is to peer through them with care and to sense where rhetoric turns into probable fact. Archaeological layers of ash, for all their eloquence, do not speak in complete sentences. They suggest a story of fire and collapse, but they cannot tell us every human decision. Combining physical evidence with contemporary accounts gives a fuller picture, but also a more troubling one: the uncertainty of exact numbers, the ambiguity of intent in individual acts of cruelty, and the fog of war that can turn neighbors into killers. This intersection of evidence and interpretation keeps the debate alive and ensures the topic remains a rich field for inquiry. Beyond the narrow frame of battle and politics lies the social history of ordinary people who lived through the siege, those whose names we do not know and whose stories are reconstructed from fragments. There were artisans who saw their workshops smashed, mothers who tried to shield infants from smoke, merchants watching inventories turn to ash, and elderly citizens who remembered a brighter city of sales and trade. Each act of loss had ripple effects. Children grew up without parents, skills were lost when craft workshops were destroyed, and networks that had kept people fed and sheltered were severed. In human terms, the fall was a culmination of countless private tragedies wrapped into a public event. The economic consequences for the wider region were immediate and long-lasting. The removal of Carthage as a commercial hub redistributed trade flows across the Mediterranean, benefiting some ports and impoverishing others. Rome absorbed many of the maritime and agricultural benefits of the region, reorganizing land and trade to suit its own needs and creating a provincial system that began to channel resources toward the Italian heartland. That redistribution of wealth was a kind of structural consequence of destruction, shaping economic maps for generations. There was also a symbolic consequence in the Mediterranean power balance. Carthage, once a counterweight to Greek and Roman influence, had served as a check on imperial homogenization, and its absence opened the door to a more pronounced Roman hegemony. Smaller states had once navigated between powers. With Carthage gone, their room for maneuver narrowed. Rome's victory, then, was not only territorial but also systemic. It altered the rules of engagement in the sea lanes and on the shores. The moral dimensions of the destruction have been argued across epochs. Some see Rome's action as a regrettable but unavoidable step in statecraft, a cold calculation of security. Others see it as an act of moral excess, a demonstration of how aspiration to empire can erode ethical boundaries until total annihilation looks feasible. The truth likely sits somewhere between these poles, an interplay of fear, opportunism, strategic thinking, and the corrosive influences of power and pride. The final days of Carthage also stand as a testament to the unpredictable consequences of protracted rivalry. What began as competition for trade and influence metastasized into hatred, fear, and the normalization of destruction as a political tool. Being locked in repeated cycles of retaliation can teach societies that elimination of a rival is a valid policy, and the case of Carthage shows how such lessons can have catastrophic human costs. For modern listeners, that historical pattern offers a cautionary mirror about how rivalry can metastasize into annihilation. Memory of Carthage has been reshaped by later artists and political writers to serve causes far removed from the 2nd century BCE. In different ages, Carthage was invoked in sermons, in revolutionary pamphlets, and in nationalist rhetoric as either an example to be admired or a cautionary tale to be avoided. Each appropriation of the narrative highlights how flexible and politically useful the image of destruction can be. History thereby becomes a resource for moral argument as much as a record of events. In the centuries after the fall, the site where Carthage had stood acquired new layers of habitation under Roman, Vandal, Byzantine, and later Islamic rule, each building over the past and leaving new traces. This accretion of cultures means that when we walk among the ruins today, we are walking through a mosaic of human stories, each layer informing and altering the sense of what Carthage had been. The persistence of habitation also disproves the simplest reading of total erasure. Life, in various forms, continued and adapted on that ground. Contemporary reflection on the fall of Carthage must grapple with the limits of moralizing from a distance. It is easy to condemn or to praise when looking back through centuries, but those judgments can obscure the complexities of the time, limited information, acute threat perceptions, and the constraints of ancient statecraft. Studying the event carefully means acknowledging Roman motives and methods while also centering the human cost experienced by the citizens of Carthage. That balanced attention yields a clearer understanding of how empires behave under pressure. As for the myths that cling to the catastrophe, they tell us more about later storytellers than about ancient soldiers. The salt story, the exact tally of casualties, the dramatic proclamations of Roman generals at the city's gates, each has been retold, amplified, and polished. That process is not merely distortion, it is the way communities wrest meaning from dramatic events, turning them into symbols that can be passed down. Learning to separate the symbol from the likely reality is part of becoming historically literate. Even in the modern era, the fall of Carthage has continued to inspire reflection on annihilation and resilience. Writers, filmmakers, and historians revisit the event to tease out human themes: courage in the face of overwhelming force, pride that refuses compromise, and the tragic consequences of absolute power. The resonance of the story lies in its mixture of brutality and pathos, a narrative that unsettles as much as it instructs. For listeners today, it remains compelling because it reveals the extremes of what humans do in the name of security and glory. One of the tragedies of such a comprehensive destruction is the loss of knowledge embedded in a civic life, records, craft techniques, and institutional memory that cannot be fully reconstructed. Libraries, archives, and private collections, if they existed in any sizable form, were likely dispersed or destroyed, and the intangible heritage of communal know-how suffered in a way that is hard to quantify. This loss is, in a sense, part of the moral argument against scorched earth policies. They do not only remove living people, they remove the wisdom of generations. Yet the story of Carthage also includes endurance of memory in surprising ways. Cultural motifs, certain crafts, and even religious practices did not disappear overnight. They migrated with survivors, influenced neighboring regions, and sometimes resurfaced in altered forms under Roman rule. Diasporic communities carried stories of the city's fall to other ports and markets, where the memory of Carthage was preserved in songs, tales, and family lore. Memory, therefore, proved more resilient than destruction alone would suggest. In considering the Roman perspective, it is useful to imagine how the triumph was felt at home: the crowding of the Forum, the speeches in the Senate, the parade of captives and loot. These public spectacles served to unify a city-state that had itself undergone social strains and class conflicts. Victory allowed Romans to externalize anxieties and to celebrate a narrative of expansion that justified domestic inequalities. The fall of Carthage thus became a tool in the hands of Roman elites as well as a military achievement. Military historians look at the siege with a focus on technique, the use of circumvallation, the cutting off of supplies, the incremental pressure of siege works, and the logistics of sustaining a long campaign. These technical aspects were not glamorous, but they were decisive. Rome did not rely purely on single decisive battles, but on institutional capacity to project power, keep troops provisioned, and methodically reduce resistance. That competence was the backbone of Roman success across many campaigns. Beyond technique, the emotional experience of Roman soldiers mattered. Many legionaries had served in multiple campaigns and understood siege warfare as both routine and extraordinary. The final moments of Carthage tested their discipline and their ability to dehumanize an enemy in the service of order or revenge. These soldiers returned home with images and stories that became part of civic identity and shaped how future generations would think about war and conquest. The fall of Carthage also invites reflection on how empires manage moral injuries. Rome had felt humbled by Hannibal and the Second Punic War, and such wounds can ferment into policies of overcorrection. In seeking to remove the danger, Rome perhaps sought to heal its collective ego, and in doing so it may have crossed lines that today prompt ethical questions. That psychological aspect, healing through domination, recurs in the history of many states and offers a cautionary point about the perils of pride on a national scale. If one travels to the ruins today and walks among columns and mosaics, it is hard not to feel the weight of what was lost and the persistence of human creativity despite catastrophe. The stones whisper not only of destruction but of the everyday lives that once made the city vital: kitchens and workshops, temples and markets, births and funerals. Standing there, one understands that the fall of Carthage is not merely an ancient headline but a human tragedy layered into the very fabric of the landscape. The lesson of Carthage for modern leaders is both simple and complex. Absolute security achieved through absolute destruction is a short-sighted solution that generates new problems even as it appears to solve old ones. Eliminating a rival can consolidate power, but it can also create vacuums, resentment, and long-term instability. The fall thus provides a historical experiment about the uses and limits of overwhelming force, an experiment that policymakers and citizens should study with humility. For historians, the tragedy also provides a reminder about the fragility of civilization. Urban life, trade networks, and cultural practices can be undone in months, sometimes even weeks, when political fury turns to annihilation. This fragility is not just a lament but an imperative, the need to build institutions, norms, and diplomatic practices that can prevent the escalation of rivalry into obliteration. Carthage's fall thus functions as a plea to future generations to find alternatives to final solutions. Artists and writers continue to draw from the imagery of the burning city to explore themes of exile, loss, and renewal. The image of a smoke-laden sky above ancient roofs is both literal and metaphorical, a powerful symbol for any story about endings and the possibility of new beginnings. In theaters and novels, the fall is a canvas on which human choices are dramatized. Courage, cowardice, sacrifice, and survival intermix in scenes that feel achingly familiar even in a different age. That continuing inspiration is one way in which the city refuses to be wholly erased from human imagination. The study of Carthage's destruction also opens important questions about the ethics of historical memory: who gets to tell the story and which voices are amplified. Many ancient written sources are Roman or Greek, and the Carthaginian voice is faint in comparison. Recovering the perspectives of ordinary Carthaginians is a challenge that requires imaginative empathy and careful use of archaeological evidence. Giving attention to those muted voices restores part of the human balance that triumphalist narratives erase. Finally, the burning of Carthage remains an event that forces listeners to confront the consequences of hatred institutionalized as policy. It is one thing to argue geopolitics and another to watch a city consumed by fire and forced migration, the faces of the displaced telling a story that is all too modern. The drama compels us to think not only about military strategy but also about the human price of decisions made in palaces and senates. If we listen closely, the fall of Carthage can teach empathy in the hardest terms, reminding us that in the calculus of empire, human lives are often the expendable variable. When Rome finished with Carthage, it believed it had erased not only a city but a rival, an idea, a way of life that had once swept the Mediterranean with ships and coins and an unmistakable purple pride. The smoke and ruin that ancient writers liked to describe became a shorthand for victory, a fable of absolute conquest that fed Roman self-image for centuries. And yet ashes scatter, memories gather. The story that survived was never merely the echo of flames, but a chorus of voices from many ages, each adding its own harmonics to the same mournful tune. The first voices were Roman and Greek, and they wrote from the seat of power and prejudice. Polybius, Livy, Appian, and later poets and historians told the tale in a language of triumph and moral lesson, framing Carthage as a cautionary example of avarice, oriental decadence, or dangerous ambition. Their pages are saturated with color and judgment, but they are also windows, often distorted, into what people feared and admired about the city that had been their most dangerous foe. As those accounts traveled through time, the narrative hardened into myth: Hannibal as genius, Carthage as treacherous, Rome as inevitable. When we peel back the rhetorical layers, another Carthage emerges in fragments and shards, and amphorae barrels and wine labels stamped across the seafloor, in the geometry of ruins that stubbornly refuse to disappear. Archaeology began to whisper where rhetoric shouted. Potsherds speak in the syntax of trade and diet. Harbor works testify to a maritime mastery that even Roman engineers envied. These material remains do not carry the moral tone of ancient historians, but they carry the stubborn rhythms of everyday life, and through them Carthage breathes again. Memory is not a single stream but a braided river of retellings. After Rome's destruction and refounding, Carthage lived under Roman law as a different city, built atop the old city's bones. The Romans reused Punic foundations, literal and cultural. Streets and public spaces were Romanized, but many of the old lifeways persisted in shops, in the hands of artisans, and in the languages murmured at market stalls. Religions kept their own archive. The cults and rituals that had given Carthage spiritual shape did not vanish in a single conflagration. Gods were absorbed and renamed, rites adapted, some sanctuaries were rebuilt in Roman styles, other shrines continued to be whispered into the Christian and then Islamic eras. Such continuity is complicated, selective, and sometimes quiet, but it is an essential thread in how the city remained present in human memory. Hannibal, more than any other figure, became the focal point of Carthage's persistence in collective imagination. He walked into Roman history like a tremor. Romans feared and admired him, Greeks told his story with fascination. To later ages, his crossing of the Alps consolidated into an image of audacity that nurtured poets and generals alike, and that image eclipsed the many other faces of Carthaginian life. Yet to reduce Carthage to Hannibal is to flatten a complex civilization into a single dramatic gesture. Carthage was built by merchants who mapped wind and sea, by farmers who irrigated plains that fed entire regions, by shipwrights who invented efficiencies that stretched Mediterranean commerce. The island of knowledge preserved and transmitted craft knowledge, agricultural treatises, maritime logs, and the legal codes that governed contracts and credit. These practical arts migrated across the sea and into the systems that Rome eventually absorbed. The oft-cited image of Cato the Elder ending every speech with Carthago delenda est is both concise history and a device for remembering. In that repetition, Rome codified an enemy and ritualized destruction. But memory's work is more subtle than slogans. It breathes into law codes, statues, and the very map of a conquered world. Rome put its mark on Carthage physically and rhetorically, but the city's original marks remain legible to those who learn a different alphabet of evidence. Language is a stubborn keeper of remnant culture. Punic, a Phoenician dialect, left inscriptions in stone and pottery and in names that stubbornly survived Roman renaming. Even as Latin inscriptions multiplied, you can find Punic epitaphs, votive dedications, personal names that resist erasure on tombs and public monuments. Language carries worldviews. The survival of Punic words on the lips of inhabitants is proof that cultural persistence works quietly, often beneath the overriding hand of empire. Memory travels through currency too, and coins are portable histories. Carthaginian coins, sometimes stamped with symbols like the palm or horse, circulated widely, and when Rome minted its own coinage, it occasionally borrowed the visual shorthand of the sea and commerce. Numismatics reveals not only economics but identity, how a people wanted to be seen and how others imagined them. Coins end up in pockets and graves and hoards, and each of those places is a small archive waiting to be read. Trade was the bloodstream of Carthaginian power, and trade leaves traces that outlast wars. Amphora fragments carry wine and oil that trace routes of consumption and preference across the Mediterranean. Shipwrecks preserve cargoes as if time had paused. Through these relics we understand that Carthage was not an isolated antagonistic power but a hub knitting city-states, colonies, and emporiums together. That connectivity persisted after Rome's victory, for trade networks are resilient, adaptable, and sometimes morally indifferent to the flags under which merchants sailed. The physical layout of Carthage, the double harbor, the quartered urban plan, was admired and copied. Roman engineers studied those harbors and incorporated lessons back into their own maritime designs. Even the Romans, who declared annihilation, became inheritors of infrastructure that had been perfected by their rivals. The echo of Punic ingenuity is audible in the stones of Roman harbors and in the continued flow of ships across the same waters. Among the most poignant survivals are agricultural treatises attributed to Punic authors, most famously the Lost Handbook of Mago. Romans prized Mago's agricultural wisdom so highly that they translated and preserved portions of it. That act of borrowing tells us that Carthage's legacy was not merely military or mercantile but also practical knowledge that shaped landscapes. The fields and olive presses of North Africa continued to bear fruit under subsequent rulers, testifying to a long-lived agrarian wisdom. Archaeology has also complicated long-standing allegations that have defined Carthage in Western imagination, like the controversial accusations of systematic child sacrifice at the Tophet. Ancient sources report dreadful rites, and some archaeological evidence, urns filled with infant remains, seems to corroborate that image. Yet modern analysis reveals a more nuanced picture: varied funerary practices, differential preservation, and the complexities of interpreting ritual contexts. The result is not a neat exoneration, but a reminder that memory can be weaponized and that material evidence rarely translates directly into moral verdicts. Memory takes shape in literature beyond history, and poets have lingered over Carthage with a variety of moods. Roman poets turned its ruins into a stage where empire rehearsed its values, while Romantic Europeans later wrote with a melancholic fascination, treating the city as an exotic ruin to be pondered in candlelight. By the 19th century, Carthage had become a symbol for colonial writers and archaeologists who often read the past through modern political lenses. These 19th-century narratives did as much to shape modern perceptions of Carthage as any Roman text had done in antiquity. The revitalization of Carthage as an archaeological site involved politics as much as scholarship. Excavations were driven not just by curiosity but by the agendas of empires and nations. French colonial authorities invested in digs and museums, and the ways they presented finds helped forge modern identities and justify rule. Local Tunisian voices, however, never completely vanished. They reasserted themselves in the 20th century as archaeology and national consciousness intertwined. By the time Tunisia gained independence, Carthage had become a powerful emblem in the national narrative, a site where ancient glories were reclaimed from imperial interpretation. The ruins were framed as an ancestral urban achievement that predated and outlasted foreign domination. This recasting is a form of memory work, to claim the past as a source of modern legitimacy and pride, recasting ruins into a story of endurance rather than ruin alone. Memory also resides in the names people give places. Across the Mediterranean, towns, hills, and bays retained echoes of Punic names or adopted new ones that nonetheless referenced earlier geographies. These place names act like geographical fossils. They preserve layers of human habitation and the persistence of memory across linguistic shifts. In naming, people carry forward stories that maps and monuments might otherwise erase. Religious memory found new tongues in the Christian and later Islamic periods. Early Christian writers in North Africa, figures such as Tertullian and Augustine who lived in the broader region, wrote with an awareness of a local past filled with pagan rites and Roman ruins. Later, when Muslim Arabs arrived in the 7th century, they encountered a landscape where Roman cities, Berber towns, and remaining Punic traces overlapped. The new inhabitants built upon these layers, sometimes literally reusing stone from older ruins, and sometimes allowing older memories to live on in the margins of their own narratives. Every archaeological season adds new verses to Carthage's long song. New discoveries refine chronologies, reveal trade links, or illuminate daily routines. Each pot or column base may seem small, but when assembled, these fragments produce an increasingly detailed atlas of lived experience. Archaeologists of the 21st century therefore join an ongoing conversation with ancient writers, with colonial excavators, and with local communities about what parts of Carthage matter and why. When modern researchers use scientific techniques to probe human remains, isotopes and DNA studies can illuminate diet, migration, and genetic ancestry in ways that ancient texts could never. These methods have sometimes confirmed the cosmopolitan composition of Carthage's population, tracing arrivals from Iberia, the Levant, and other Mediterranean regions. Where once identity might have been reduced to the binary of victor and vanquished, science reveals networks of movement and the permeability of cultural borders. Histories of memory must also reckon with silence. Not every voice was recorded, and not every community left a visible trace. Women, artisans, enslaved people, and rural villagers often exist in the archaeological record in ways that are hard to interpret. Yet their lives were essential to the making and remaking of Carthage, and their traces, hearths, spindle whorls, small domestic shrines, are vital clues that animate a fuller picture of continuity beneath the rhetoric of annihilation. The Mediterranean itself is a memory keeper. Currents and winds remembered by sailors, the patterns of fish migration, and the geological contours of the coast shaped human settlement and survival. Carthage was profoundly maritime, and to understand its echo we must listen to the long dialogue between people and sea. Harbors silenced by war still whisper in sediments and ship timbers about goods and ideas that once flowed in abundance. Cultural memory travels through intimate things as well, cooking techniques, recipes, flavors that outlast civilizations. The olive, the date palm, the grain varieties cultivated across North Africa reflect centuries of selective knowledge. Agricultural terraces and irrigation channels carved by Carlo's ancestors were mended and reused under Roman rule and after. When people still gather around a bowl, taste can become a time machine, linking present meals to ancient tables. Small objects often become messengers of continuity. Jewelry styles, fibulae, and woven patterns preserved in images or fragments show how fashion and identity evolve across conquests. When a woman in late antiquity wore jewelry with motifs derived from Punic designs, she enacted a continuity that textual histories might miss. Such gestures of style can be as revealing as declarations carved into stone. Cities remember through institutions as well. Markets, guilds, religious fraternities, and courts transmit procedures and norms. The legal and commercial mechanisms that govern contracts, shipping, and credit have echoes in later Roman and medieval practices. Administration, after all, is as much conservator as conqueror. Certain efficient practices survived conquest because they made life workable whether a city bowed to Rome or rose again in a different political climate. Memory is a social act and it requires storytellers. From priests to merchants to writers to, later, archaeologists, people tell stories that answer questions about identity and belonging. In the centuries after Carthage's fall, these stories wrestled with shame and pride, with triumph and nostalgia. People construct narratives to make sense of suffering and success, and those narratives circulate, evolve, and sometimes contradict one another. In art and imagination, ruin becomes a potent motif. Painters, writers, and musicians in later European centuries found in Carthage the perfect subject for meditations on empire and moral decline. The city's ruins were aestheticized into romantic landscapes that bore little resemblance to the daily lives they once cradled, but these images nonetheless shaped broader public perceptions. The aestheticization was itself a form of memory, selecting some aspects of the past and enhancing them into moral allegories. Monuments and museums become curators of memory, choosing what to display and how. The way artifacts from Carthage are presented in museums, what gets lit, what gets captioned, affects the stories audiences leave with. Curatorial choices are often political, sometimes scholarly, and always interpretive. A museum can revive or suppress certain narratives. Through these institutions, memory is packaged and transported into public consciousness. The modern Tunisian relationship with Carthage is a complex choreography of pride, tourism, scholarship, and politics. The site draws visitors from across the world, and tourism itself shapes how the past is curated. Local communities engage with this dynamic, sometimes welcoming the attention and occasionally pushing back against narratives that exoticize or commodify their heritage. The negotiation over Carthage's meaning is ongoing and reflective of contemporary identities. Memory writes itself into the landscape not only through monuments but through what people decide to preserve. Some ancient structures are reconstructed, some are left as ruins, and some are reburied to protect them. Each choice is an editorial judgment about what the past should look like for future eyes. The care given to the site is a form of dialogue between generations about what parts of memory deserve permanence. The echo of Carthage also reached distant literatures. In the modern European canon, writers used Carthage as a symbol in debates about civilization, empire, and the costs of hubris. These echoes traveled into political rhetoric and into cultural self-understanding across generations. Carthage was not only a North African memory, it became part of a pan-Mediterranean imaginary where ancient examples were pressed into service for contemporary debates. Scholars continue to argue about Carthage's core identity. Was it fundamentally Phoenician, a hybrid Mediterranean city, or something else entirely? The question reveals as much about the questioners as the subject. In seeking to define Carthage, historians expose the limitations of categories and the fluidity of cultural identities that refuse tidy classification. Carthage's hybridity is central to its endurance as a memory because it allowed the city to be many things to many people across time. Museums and archaeological parks are not only repositories but stages where national stories are performed. In Tunisia, as in other countries with deep layered pasts, the archaeological narrative sometimes competes with modern political narratives. How to tell a past that includes foreign masters, colonizers, and indigenous continuity is a challenging dramaturgy, and the script changes with shifts in power and public desire. Education molds collective memory too. How children learn about Carthage in school, whether as a villain of Roman annals or as an ancestor of Tunisian statehood, shapes how entire societies remember. Curricula highlight certain episodes and downplay others, and those choices ripple through generations. Schools are among the most effective mechanisms for shaping how a civilization is perceived and remembered. Travelers' accounts and travel writing in the 18th and 19th centuries reintroduced Carthage to European public imagination. Early explorers romanticized ruins, describing them in lavish prose that conflated archaeological observation with literary fancy. Those travelogues, often accompanied by sketches and later photographs, circulated widely and fed the growing appetite for classical antiquities and exotic history. The discipline of archaeology itself matured amid debates about Carthage's meaning. Early excavators sometimes prioritized dramatic finds and the search for famous figures over systematic study of daily life. Over time, fieldwork professionalized and shifted toward context-driven approaches, deepening our understanding of ordinary citizens whose lives archaeology could now more faithfully reconstruct. Modern methods emphasize stratigraphy, context, and multidisciplinary collaboration, which together create more nuanced memories of the past. Memory, like language, is transmitted through family stories. Oral traditions in North African rural communities sometimes preserve echoes that are at odds with textual histories. Stories of lost wells, family legends of ancestors who traded with distant ports, or tales of saints linked to ancient ruins persist in ways that written sources overlook. Oral memory complicates and enriches the written archive because it carries affect, personal stakes, and local knowledge across generations. Intellectuals across eras have sometimes used Carthage as a mirror to reflect on empire and its consequences. For colonial critics in the 20th century, Carthage offered a cautionary tale about domination and resistance. For nationalists, it became a symbol of an uninterrupted local dignity that antedated and outlived foreign rule. These competing appropriations show the malleability of ancient memory and how it is reworked to animate present political and cultural projects. Even in language of international scholarship, the study of Carthage reveals the politics of academic attention. Which questions attract funding and which remain neglected tell us about priorities in intellectual life as much as they tell us about gaps in the archaeological record. Interdisciplinary projects that link archaeology, philology, and climate science are now revealing dimensions of Carthage's story that earlier specialists could not access. Environmental memory registers in the soils around Carthage. Pollen cores, sediment layers, and changes in coastline document how human activity reshaped the landscape, how agriculture expanded, how forests retreated, and how harbors silted. These environmental archives show the long-term interplay between ecological change and human adaptation, offering another channel through which Carthage's presence lingers in the earth itself. Museums and archives continue to digitize collections, and in doing so they create new memoryscapes accessible across continents. Digitized inscriptions, high-resolution images of artifacts, and virtual reconstructions allow global audiences to engage with Carthage without being on site. This digital turn expands memory's reach but also raises questions about authenticity, interpretation, and the ethics of access. Memory's persistence is also a story of appropriation and retrieval. Artifacts displaced during colonial excavations now sit in museums far from their origins, and their removal shapes global perceptions of the past. Debates over restitution and repatriation ask not only about ownership of objects but about the right to shape narratives. When items return to their countries of origin, memory is reclaimed in a palpable way. Stories can again be told from closer to their roots. Carrying memory forward requires translation, both literal translation of texts and cultural translation between generations. Translators of Punic fragments, of Roman accounts, and of later Arabic and Berber texts perform the labor of making ancient voices intelligible. Each translation is an interpretation and thus a new layer of memory that colors how future readers will hear the past. Cultural memory sometimes finds its expression in music and ritual. Folk melodies or ritual songs that have been passed down may contain structural patterns or modes that resonate with ancient practices, even when direct continuity is impossible to prove. Listening to the music of a region can therefore be another way to access intangible echoes of historical experience. Memory is also spatial in the sense that people experience the past by walking through it. Visitors to the ruins often sense a physical continuity that eludes purely textual engagement. Stepping onto a paved street or into a basilica creates an embodied link. Walking a site engages senses and imagination, allowing memory to be experienced as movement through time as well as space. Writing about Carthage has always been a moral act, because the city's image carries ethical lessons about ambition, commerce, and imperial violence. Different eras emphasized different morals. The Romans emphasized military virtue, later Europeans pondered decadence and decline, while modern scholars and citizens interrogate the costs of colonialism and the politics of heritage. These shifting morals show how memory is an ethical conversation through time. The persistence of Carthage in modern popular culture, films, novels, and documentaries shows how ancient memory becomes entertainment and public pedagogy. Popular retellings sometimes smooth complexities for narrative effect, but they also make the story available to wider audiences who may later seek out more nuanced histories. The interplay between scholarly nuance and popular narrative is a continuing dialogue about what the past means to present people. Carthage's memory also survives in the quiet work of conservators and restorers who mend pottery, stabilize mosaics, and preserve inscriptions. Such work is painstaking and often invisible to the public, yet it prevents physical memory from crumbling away. The careful touch of conservators keeps traces legible and accessible for the next generation of listeners and readers. Every excavation season reframes questions about identity and continuity, and scholars often return to the same questions with new tools and hypotheses. The process of re-examination is itself a form of memory work. Hypotheses are tested, narratives refined, and earlier misconceptions corrected. Scholarship is iterative, and through it the echo of Carthage becomes clearer even as it remains complex and contested. Memory is never static. New finds provoke fresh narratives, and public interest waxes and wanes with politics, education, and cultural fashion. At times Carthage is at the center of scholarly attention, at other times it becomes an undercurrent, known but not loudly debated. The ebb and flow of this attention is part of the larger rhythm of how societies engage with their pasts. The international significance of Carthage grows when scholars place it within Mediterranean-wide networks of exchange and influence. Rather than a city isolated in opposition to Rome, Carthage appears in this frame as a node in a dense web of interactions. That networked view helps explain why Carthaginian practices and goods continue to resonate even after political domination shifted. When people debate heritage, they often invoke Carthage to justify larger claims about civilization and identity. That rhetorical use can empower communities by connecting them to an illustrious past, or it can be exploited by elites to assert exclusionary narratives. Thus, memory becomes a terrain of political negotiation, shaping how the past is used in service of present goals. The study of Carthage's echo and memory is also a study of silence and exclusion. Which stories have been amplified, and which have been muted? Recovering suppressed voices, like those of working people, slaves, and marginalized communities, requires careful attention to small and often overlooked remains. Bringing those voices into the narrative enriches and complicates our understanding of continuity and loss. Carthage's modern presence is also expressed in civic rituals and commemorations that sometimes evoke the ancient city. Annual events, educational programs, and public scholarship can reanimate memory for contemporary audiences, inviting citizens to engage with their past in ways that matter to their present. Such rituals are modern articulations of continuity, staking a claim to heritage in ways visible and performative. Memory acts through pedagogy in universities and museums where Carthage is taught as part of ancient history, archaeology, and heritage studies. Students are the next generation of rememberers, and their training shapes the kinds of narratives that will circulate. The interdisciplinarity of such programs encourages students to see Carthage as a complex society with many afterlives rather than a footnote in Roman triumphalism. Carthage's echo is linguistic as well as material. Modern languages of North Africa have absorbed layers of vocabulary and idiom that reflect centuries of contact between peoples. While direct derivatives of Punic are rare in everyday speech, linguistic substrata can persist in dialects, place names, and oral formulas. Tracing these echoes requires patience and nuance, and the work of historical linguists often uncovers surprising continuities. Artistic responses to Carthage in recent decades have sought to reclaim the city's image from both colonial romanticism and Roman triumphalism. Contemporary artists reinterpret ruins, artifacts, and narratives to engage with themes of memory, loss, and resilience. Their works challenge audiences to see ancient Carthage not as a mere tourist backdrop but as a living conversation partner in debates about identity and history. Civic engagement around the site involves not only scholars and tourists but also local residents who live near the ruins and negotiate their daily relationship with ancient layers. For them, heritage is an everyday matter. It impacts property, local economy, and community identity. Ensuring that local voices are included in decision-making about preservation and interpretation is essential to ethical stewardship of memory. Museums and scholars now increasingly aim to tell more inclusive stories about Carthage, integrating archaeological data with human narratives that convey lived experience. Exhibitions that include reconstructions of homes, markets, and workshops help visitors imagine the rhythms of ancient life. These reconstructions function not as speculative fantasies but as empathetic bridges connecting people across millennia. Memory also enters the realm of law through heritage protection statutes, UNESCO designations, and international agreements. Such legal frameworks create responsibilities to protect cultural landscapes, and they shape what can be excavated, restored, or displayed. The legal protection of sites reflects a collective decision to enshrine certain memories in law and to regard them as part of humanity's common heritage. Carthage's story in education, museums, and public discourse is continually rewritten, and each rewrite reflects contemporary values and priorities. In some eras, emphasis falls on military conflict and moralistic lessons, in others, on trade, agriculture, or cultural hybridity. The shifting emphases tell us less about the past's fixed identity and more about the present's changing concerns. Global conversations about restitution and the decolonization of museums have crucial implications for how Carthage is remembered internationally. Returning artifacts or recontextualizing collections can transform narratives, allowing source communities to reclaim the stories tied to material culture. These debates are not merely about objects, they are about who has the authority to tell history and how that history circulates in the world. Scholars increasingly emphasize the need to listen to local knowledge systems and oral histories when reconstructing memory. Communities often retain environmental knowledge, place-based stories, and ritual practices that enrich archaeological interpretation. Responsible scholarship combines scientific techniques with respect for local memory practices, creating a more holistic understanding of the past and its afterlives. The echo of Carthage is audible in modern political rhetoric as well, sometimes deployed to rally nationalist sentiment or to question foreign interventions. Political leaders who invoke ancient glories tap into deep reservoirs of memory that can unite or divide. These invocations remind us that ancient history is never neutral, it is always implicated in modern imaginations and agendas. Carthage's afterlife also involves sensory history, attempts to reconstruct the sounds, smells, and textures of the ancient city. Mosaics and frescoes suggest color palettes, market finds imply aromas of spices and fish, the geometry of streets hints at urban noise patterns. Imagining the senses of past life makes memory visceral, and it helps listeners and readers inhabit the past a little more fully. Finally, perhaps the most enduring form of Carthage's survival is in the very act of asking questions about it. Each new generation that studies the city, that walks its ruins, that listens to its stories, contributes to a living memory that refuses to be wholly silenced. The echo of ashes is not only about what was lost, but about what was carried forward, adapted, and transformed across centuries of human life and imagination. The ruins still whisper, and every listener becomes part of the story. Subscribe and share in the comments whether what moves you more is what Carthage lost or what humanity carried forward.